From the author of A Practical Guide to Evil, comes the Pale Light series. Book I, Lost Things. Tristan Abrascal is a thief, one of many making their living under the perpetual twilight of the greatest city in all of Vesper. Quick wit and a contract with a capricious goddess have always kept him one step ahead, until one night he crosses a line by accident that burns all the bridges he had left. But not all is lost, as his mentor offers a way out of peril that turns out to be more than a simple escape. It is also an opportunity to get even with the Infanzones, the nobles he's lived under all his life, and it so happens that Tristan has a full ledger's worth of scores to settle with them. Lady Angharade Tredegar has fled halfway across the world, leaving behind a ruin of a life, her family butchered by a ruthless enemy, their estate torched and their nobility revoked. Yet no matter how far she flees, the blades of assassins follow, and she finds herself growing desperate for any protection. She has one relative left to call on, her estranged uncle, but she finds that the safety he offers comes at a cost. Angharade has sworn revenge, however, and her honor will allow for no compromise. She will do what she must to survive so that one day bloody vengeance can be visited upon her enemies. The paths of the two take them to the doorstep of the Watch, but for desperate souls like them enrollment is a lost cause. They will have to do it the hard way instead, by surviving the trials on the isle known as the Dominion of Lost Things, where every year many go, and few return. Book 2, Good Treasons. The trials of the Dominion are over. The 4 survivors have become students of Sholomance, enrolling together as a cabal. Yet even on those infamous grounds they soon learn none are beyond the reach of their paths. Angharade Tredegar is returned to a semblance of the world she left behind, but finds her honor sorely tested by bargains offered, every bit as tempting as in the stories and even deadlier. Tristan Abrascal needs answers. Mysterious enemies keep trying to abduct him, his classroom does not exist and he's now had several conversations with dead people. Worst of all, his carrots keep dying. Mariam Kamif is going mad, which would worry her less if it were happening on schedule. More frightening yet is the possibility that she is not, and there truly is someone else going around wearing her face. Sangren must forge the others into a functional unit, all the while fending off enemies on all sides, rival cables, vengeful countrymen and the deluge of implacable foes her companions simply cannot seem to stop attracting. Failure is not an option, for Song must bring back honor to her family's name. Whatever the cost, it is the only way to keep their disgrace from literally eating them all alive. And as the 4 chase shadows and Sholomance, in the distance looms the greater test awaiting them in the Asphodel Rectorate. Asphodel is a faded power, the rotten carcass of what it once was, but under that rot looms darker things, of which monsters might just be the least dangerous. Besides, is treason really such an evil when you have the best of reasons for it? Chapter 1. None of the skeleton keys were working. The landlord must have sprung for good locks, which was admittedly rather sensible of the man considering that Tristan was currently trying to rob one of his patrons. You should have started with the lockpicks, Fortuna said. Told you, didn't I? She was leaning against the dingy wall in the weak light of the sole lantern in the hallway, long red dress sweeping to the ground and her tone openly bored. She had not lowered her voice in the slightest, which would have risked waking up their friend on the other side of the door if anyone but Tristan could hear her. They couldn't, any more than they could see or touch her. Fortuna herself still had the senses, but she had grown far too weak to touch the material world. As far as he knew, Tristan Abrascal was the sole contractor to the Lady of Long Odds in all of Vesper, and he knew much. Fortuna was not the kind of goddess that disliked the sound of her own voice. And to think I was once mistress of queens and emperors. Entire festivals were thrown to earn even a single approving glance from me, Tristan, Fortuna mourned. Now all I may call on is a single orphan, one with terribly middling thieving skills. He rolled his eyes. All the old gods liked to claim they had once been the greatest deity to ever crawl out of the ether to make pacts with men, or even rule over them, back in the times of the old night, but in his experience most of them were no more glorious than the dusty thieves and beggars of the murk they made contracts with. Love you too, Tristan murmured back as he reached for the lockpicks. Mere possession of that neat leather sheath would be enough to earn him a whipping before he was thrown into a cell, should the Guardia catch him with it. Not that they ever had. He opened it to reveal a well-oiled set of tools, one which he knew to be starkly expensive when crafted with such quality. They'd been a gift from Abuela, though like all her gifts he'd had to earn it on his own. He slowly inserted the tension wrench into the lock, as not to make enough noise to wake the man on the other side of the door, and then began to work the pick. Quickly he raised an eyebrow. The landlord of the Azaleo was a wealthy man, for the hostel was the largest in all of Estabur district, and Estabur was by far the wealthiest of the half-dozen districts known as the Merc. It seemed, however, that in this instance the size of the establishment had worked against the landlord. Almost 100 rooms meant that it would have cost a king's ransom to have good locks on every door, unless they were bought in bulk from one of the great workshops. Those mass models were identical, even the good ones all had the same weaknesses. Fortuna, resting a hand on the wall, leaned over his shoulder to have a closer look. He could feel her breath against his cheek, warm and soft. An illusion, he thought, but one so convincing as to outstrip even the truth. A gongman lock? The goddess asked. You know those. What's taking you so? With a muted sound, thank the gods for whichever servant was being dutiful about keeping these well-oiled. The lock popped open. He offered Fortuna an angelic smile, to which she rolled her eyes. The goddess could be considered a great beauty, he knew, with those vivid green eyes and that hair of gold, yet even as a young boy he'd not been spellbound by her appearance. The Lady of Long Odds was essentially a collection of terrible habits made into a deity, after all, and she was not particularly good at hiding this. Not that Tristan minded. His was not the kind of life that some ancient and glorious mane would have ever deigned to grace with a pact, much less one as close and intimate as the one he shared with Fortuna. Besides, the mere thought of being bound to one of those pristine old monsters was enough to sicken him. Let the Infanzones keep the privilege, may they choke on it on each other. The tools went back into the sheath, and Tristan folded it closed before stashing it away in the stitched inner pocket of his coat. He made sure that the skeleton keys he'd put away in another pocket were still wedged among feathers, so that they would not make noise as he moved, and then laid a finger on handle of the black jack at his hip. He did not like killing, not strangers anyway, which was why he preferred it to the daggers most in his trade used. The small weapon of leather and lead was a good fit for his hand, and he'd practice with it, though if Tristan had his way there would be no violence tonight. In and out with the chest he'd come to steal, the man in the room none the wiser until tomorrow. Ideally. Tonight, however, was a test of Abuela's. Those did not tend to be painless, for all that they inevitably ended up teaching him valuable lessons. Tristan slowly cracked the door open, a sliver of dim light from the lantern in the hall slinking through into the dark. He'd looked into other rooms over the last few days so that he would know where the beds and tables were positioned, and from what he could see through the crack there had been no change in arrangement. The table was in the corner to the right, with a single chair, which meant the bed ought to be just outside his angle of sight, left corner, close to but not outright propped against the wall. From the corner of his eye he saw Fortuna wink at him and he smiled back. She'd earlier agreed to keep watch outside the room, after some wheedling. Tristan opened the door a little wider, crept through and then softly closed it behind him. The young thief waited silently until his eyes got used to the darkness, pricking his ears. The steady breath of a sleeping man was all he heard, along with a body moving around under covers. The room itself was fairly bare. On the right there was the table and chair he had glimpsed earlier, with what looked to be a few papers and a writing kit. On the left there was the bed, a wooden frame with a straw mattress. At its foot was a trunk provided for the guests to stash their personal affairs. Tristan saw a pistol and arming sword placed atop it, over a half-folded black cloak. The last detail had him going still as a stone. The sleeping man was one of the watch. If so, this was turning out to be a blunder. Stealing from the blast cloak was a bad idea even at the best of times, for they were talented killers one and all. But if it turned out that Tristan was obstructing a contract, then it wouldn't be the man alone that came for him. The entire free company he belonged to would become involved. Even worse, It was said that the watch was bound by ancient treaty never to take contracts within Sacramonte save at the invitation of the Infantzon, so he must have stopped. His thoughts halted, and the young thief turned a considering eye to the sleeping man. It was Abuela that had sent him on this test. He had forgotten his surprise, and Tristan had long suspected that Abuela herself was one of the watch. There must be more to this than met the eye. And if the man was here on a contract, why was he alone? The Infantzon, the nobles that ruled Sacramonte, they had their favorite companies to contract with when they needed work done in the city. None of those companies were small, each storied and famous and near an army in its own right. And none of them would put up one of their men in a place like the Azulejo, Tristan thought. So was the man here on private business? No, the thief decided, else he would not have dared to bring with him the black cloak that was as a badge of office for the watch. Tristan's eyes narrowed. He had only suppositions, but too many details were not adding up. His gut was saying deserter, and Tristan the Brascal trusted his gut. Which meant he was now free to steal from the stranger once more, if a great deal more warily. A deserter's knife would kill him just as dead if it slipped through his ribs. From the corner of his eye he saw that Fortuna had gotten bored of keeping an eye out for him and followed him into the room. He swallowed a sigh at the sight of her curiously peering at the papers on the table. It had only been a matter of time until she wandered off, though he'd hoped for a little longer. The goddess glanced his way, crooking a finger to summon him, but he shook his head. He had come for the chest Abuela had sent him after, nothing else. No good would come of getting involved in watch business any more than he already was. He wasn't seeing said chest, unfortunately, but then he'd not moved much. He crept a little deeper into the room, eyes seeking, and found what he was looking for. But a few moments later, bare as the rented room was, there were no real hiding places to speak of. The chest had simply been nestled by the side of the trunk, half covered by the cloak. It was easy to recognize from the description he'd been given: slit dark wood with leather stripes to make it easy to carry on one's back, and burnished copper hinges. Inside were pieces of glass and metal, Abuela had said, so he would need to be careful when moving it, let it make a ruckus. Fortuna was looking his way still, insistently gesturing for him to come at her side, but he shook his head at her with growing irritation. He crept closer to the foot of the bed, angling so that the trunk would hide him as he began to grasp the wooden chest. A tentative nudge established it was not all that heavy, intriguingly enough, so Tristan quieted his breath and slid aside the edge of the cloak so that he could begin moving the chest without dragging the black wool with it. "Tristan, you need to read this," Fortuna quietly said. "The man is on a contract." The young thief turned in startlement, finding the goddess' face grown grave in the dark. He noticed, a heartbeat too late, that her eyes were going wide. The cold muzzle of a pistol touched the back of his neck. "Oh thief, are you?" The voice was calm, but anger lurked close to the surface. The Aztlan accent was faint but noticeable, mostly in the way that the words clicked against the tongue. Tristan swallowed, then painted a winning smile on his face. He was not yet dead, which meant there was still time to dig himself out of the grave he dug himself into. "All men are thieves, arguably," he replied. "It is only that the rich name it rent or tax instead, so that we might forget what it is." A snort of reluctant amusement. "So you're a Republican thief?" Presumably the man meant in political philosophy rather than race, as even in the dark it would be difficult for Tristan to pass as Tianxi. "Nothing so grand," Tristan denied. "I am a loyal son of Sacramonte, sir. My faith goes to the law of rats. The cornered fight, the hungry bite, the beggared snatch. So went the law of rats, as written in the famous poetess Ilaria's verse. There was not a soul in the city that had not heard the poem, and to many of them it was as much the writ of the world as any decree of the Infantzon." Tristan made a turn, to have a better look at the man holding a pistol to his neck, but the stranger clicked his tongue disapprovingly. "None of that," the watchman said. "Not unless you want the trigger pulled." Tristan went still. In front of him Fortuna stood, eyeing the man and shaking her head. The stranger was not bluffing, the pistol was fully cocked. "It may be that you are of the city," the man said, "but this is not petty theft. The room has a good lock, and I do not have the looks of an easy or wealthy mark. What are you here after, boy? Tristan hesitated. So you were sent, the man stated, tone confident. Too confident, really, the young thief frowned. He glanced at Fortuna, who had no answer to give save a grimace. Did the other man possess a contract with a god as well? If so, this conversation was even more dangerous than he'd thought, and it had begun with a pistol being pressed against his neck. Who was it that did the sending? The man asked. Give me a name and you won't need to die tonight. It's your master that is my foe, not you. Maybe if he'd been looking at the face, it would have made a difference. Tristan would have been able to see the Aslan features, the darker skin and broad chin. It wouldn't have been the voice alone, speaking words he had heard before. Maybe not the same, not exactly, but didn't they all mean the same thing? Landlords and bosses and in fan zones, all looking down from across the table with that merciful smile. Just give us names, they asked. You will be spared, forgiven, absolved. But give us the names. Give us your cousins and your neighbors and your friends. Give us names so that we might feed on all who defy us, and you will be eaten the last. Tristan knew better than to believe in the promise. His father had died teaching him that lesson. Careful now, the man said, tone cold. Know when you're beaten, boy. Tristan the rascal smiled. Fortuna smiled back, a goddess adorned in gold and blood, her teeth pale as ivory and sharp as knives. I do, he replied, and borrowed luck. The ticking in the back of his head began, like the moving gears of a clock, but the noise was drowned out by that of a trigger being pulled. The flint came down, but instead of striking the pan and igniting the powder, it snapped clean off. Tristan's luck had been the very finest, for the flintlock to misfire so catastrophically. He'd have to pay for it later. The man cursed and the young thief turned as he rose, blackjack already in hand. The blast cloak took the strike on his chin well, turning with the blow, and it was Tristan's turn to curse. He wasn't sure he'd win a real fight, he'd been hoping to end it quick. Instead, the ticking in his head still trotting forward at that same steady pace, he was dragged by the man onto the bed. Entangled in the sheets like a farce of hateful lovers, the two of them wrestled as they tried to keep away the other's weapon and strike clean, Tristan with his jack, the man with the butt of his pistol. He landed a blow, and a solid one, on the side of the man's head. The Aslan was stunned, but not so stunned that he did not smash the pistol into Tristan's stomach. Gasping, the thief drew back and was unceremoniously kicked in the chest with bruising strength. He tumbled out of the bed even as the man rose, half getting up from his sprawl only to have the broken pistol thrown in his face. He ducked down and shouted. And fuck, he could see the man reaching for the pistol still on top of the trunk. Thinking fast, Tristan tossed back the pistol that had just bruised his chin. The man's arm rose to protect his own head, but it hadn't been the blast cloak Tristan was aiming at. The pistol atop the trunk went tumbling down to the ground, powder and shot spilling all over the floor. Snarling, the Aslan instead reached for the sheathed sword. The thief panicked, for a moment, because what was a blackjack going to help against a blade? The sheets, Fortuna hissed. Body moving without hesitation, Tristan snatched the sheets off the bed and threw them at the watchman even as he drew the sword. The stranger hacked blindly at the cotton, ripping into it, but it wasn't enough. Forcing himself to go forward instead of back as his instincts screamed he should, Tristan's fingers tightened around his blackjack and he raised his arm. He darted in quick, smashing into the side of the man's head once more. The blast cloak stumbled, still hacking away with the blade, and Tristan wasn't quick enough to avoid getting his left arm nicked. Gritting his teeth, he hit again. The man toppled over the trunk, falling back and over it as the thief followed. He hit again and again, the jack impacting the sheet-covered face until it came back red and the man was no longer moving. Tristan stayed there, kneeling and panting. Fuck, he rasped out. Ripping away the sheet, he winced at the bruised and bloody mess he had made of the Aslan. Had he killed him? A finger under the nose showed the watchman was still breathing, but he'd taken bad hits. There was no telling, and Tristan had read 2 books on medicine, but he was far from a cutter, much less a real doctor. His fingers closed around the handle of his blackjack. Should he? You aren't getting up, Fortuna noted. He saw my face, Tristan quietly said. He doesn't have a name, but he saw my face. If he is part of the watch, they could come for me. He had never killed someone who couldn't fight back before. He hesitated. In the back of his mind, the ticking continued. He would have to even those scales soon, he knew, or the price would get worse. Mercy is always a gamble, Fortuna said, tone sympathetic. Tristan breathed out slowly. The decision was made. There's already been enough of those tonight, he said, and set down the blackjack on the floor. Arms tightening, he snapped the man's neck the way Abuela had taught him it should be done. The death was swift and hopefully painless. Mercy any greater than that should not be asked of rats. Tristan rose, taking back his blackjack, and steadied himself. He avoided looking at the dead man, instead reaching for the chest he'd come for. It was as light as he'd felt, and clearly filled at least in part with some vials by the noise it made when moved. The leather straps were easy to slide over his shoulder, so he did and found the weight further eased. Now was not the time to look at what was inside, curious as he was. Tristan suddenly winced, the ticking in the back of his mind that had never ceased suddenly quickened. Shit, he had dallied for too long. Fingers clenched, Tristan warily released the lock he had borrowed. Like bowstring, the power of his pact with Fortuna snapped the opposite way it had been dragged. He had gained luck, and so now he must suffer misfortune. Cautiously the thief cast a look around, trying to gauge where the blow would come from, but for a few heartbeats nothing happened. Then there was a faint clicking sound, as the well-oiled lock that he had picked to enter the room opened again. The door swung open half a foot, just enough for the woman passing by it to glance curiously. She froze, dark eyes going wide as she saw the shape of the corpse on the floor and Tristan standing with his ill-gotten goods. Well, Tristan faintly thought, that was going to be somewhat difficult to explain. He opened his mouth to speak, but already the woman was running down the hall and shouting. Fuck. It was more than time to get out of here. Take the papers too, Fortuna said. He goggled at her. How would that help anything? It will make things woe, trust me, the goddess urged. Take the papers. Cursing under his breath, he brushed aside a quill to snatch up the sheath of papers and crammed them into the pocket of his coat. It would be difficult to run without wrecking whatever lay inside the chest, he thought, but with any luck he wouldn't need to. Back in the hall he heard shouting downstairs, where the woman was naming him a murderer, not undeservedly, and patrons were shouting in dismay. There were roughs in the landlord's employ down there and going through would see him caught or killed even if it was the quickest path to a door out of the azulejo. Thankfully, Tristan had not come by the front door and had no intention of leaving that way either. Hurrying to the last door down the hallway he pushed it open with no resistance, shutting it behind him. It was empty save for the furnishings, identical to the room where he'd killed a man save for one salient difference, the same open window above the table that he'd come in through. He'd had to cut through the hinges of the shutters earlier, but now the way was clear straight to the rope he'd left dangling. He climbed up without hesitation, wood groaning under his weight, and began by pushing through the chest. Once it was through, grunting with effort he slid one of the leather straps onto the curved hooks bound to the rope. It dangled a bit outside, he saw, but held. Tristan could hear people running up the stairs, even through the door, and he hastened through the window himself. Feet first, he wiggled through the opening and felt nothing at all under him for a delicious heartbeat before tightening his grip on the rope and pulling himself close to the wall. It was not so long a fall that he would not survive it, should he drop down into the alley below, but he might just break a leg. That sort of thing tended to make running away harder, he'd heard. He slid the chest back onto his back and climbed down, quirking an eyebrow when a glance above found Fortuna leaning through the window with a smile. They found the body, the goddess told him. And they're opening all the doors. He sighed. If they found the rope, and they likely would, they'd know to pursue in the streets. It was a descent of about 20 feet, far from hard even after being nicked by a blade, and he was done with it before they'd opened the door. He left the rope there. It had not been cheap, but he didn't have the time to bring it down and began to make his way through his escape path. The way out was always the first part to plan out, when thieving. There was no point in stealing anything if you got caught with the goods in hand. He moved out at a brisk pace and kept to the alleys, even though the main streets would have been quicker, moving in a vague diagonal towards the east. Estebre district was the nicest part of the Merc as well as the wealthiest, so here the lamplights were kept glowing on the main streets through the night instead of dimmed or snuffed as they would be in the rest of the Merc. Best to stay out of that, too much risk of someone seeing his face even if the roughs didn't catch up. It seemed like they would not, after all. At first Tristan heard shouts out in the street, but a quarter hour later there were only the noises of Sacromonte at night reaching his ear, the burn of the lamplights, the quiet talk of the awful men clearing the streets, and the occasional sounds of revelry drifting out of some bawdy house. No one respectable was out at this hour, which had always amused him. Was the firmament any less dark during day than night? It was only the lamps that made a difference, lamps in the notions of men. The thief did not slow his footsteps until he'd reached the eastern border of the Estebre district, near one of the gates that would lead him into Arturo. There a lone man carrying a nice chest might find himself preyed upon, should he not be careful, so Tristan found an empty alley whose mouth was near a lamplight and settled in the shadows to have a look at what he'd taken. It had better be worth it, he thought, for Abuela's test had seen him kill a man. He would not blame her for a deed done by his hand, but she had hidden things from him. If he'd known there was a watchman involved. Too late for regrets now, he reminded himself. Fortuna was seated atop what looked like a pile of iron scraps, her red dress somehow artfully draped as if it were a throne, and it was with eagerness she looked at the chest when he set it down. "Treasures, do you think?" the goddess asked. "I heard vials within," Tristan murmured back. "There are elixirs worth as much as diamonds," Fortuna insisted. That was true enough, but Tristan doubted any of them were to be found in hostels of the Estebre districts guarded by a single mon. The chest of slit dark wood was kept closed by copper latches that popped open after he exerted some strength, revealing an elaborate interior. There were 23 small drawers, each marked with a carved symbol, that filled the four sides of the box. The middle of it was hollow, pincers of brass holding small vials containing liquids in shades of gray and green. "A medicine box?" Fortuna said, sounding skeptical. The symbols were familiar, Tristan thought. He opened the drawer at the top left and his brow rose when he found within a neatly wrapped bundle of small dark leaves. Perfectly oval, none larger than the tip of a finger. Black verde, he realized, and very carefully wrapped it back without his fingers touching any of the leaves. "A poison box," Tristan replied, frown deepening. "And one I know how to use. It looks much like the one drawn in Alvareno's dosages." Were he a gambling man, and he was, he would wager that the drawers and vials would perfectly match the diagram the book had displayed, including the various herbs and substances suggested by the author. Which went some way in explaining why Abuela had insisted he read and commit the work to memory a few months back, well before she had ever brought up this test, but still left him confused. What use did he have for a poisoner's kit? He was a thief by trade, not a killer. Tristan's hands were far from clean, but he did not go out of his way to stain them. A little more exciting, Fortuna conceded. Still frowning, Tristan reached for the papers he had taken. Perhaps they would shed some light on this. He brought them closer to the light of the street, breathing in sharply when he saw that the very first seemed to be a contract. Had he really killed a watchman out on a job? He kept reading, going through the cramped lines of lettering, and then softly cursed. "Told you leaving them would be worse, didn't I?" Fortuna drawled. "He was employed by the Aurelana brothers," Tristan hissed. "Everyone knows they're a front for the Hoyaroya. This is going to get me killed." The Hoyaroya were either an association of upstanding landlords and merchants or one of the most successful guild of crooks in the Merc, depending on who you asked. They were also notoriously touchy about honor, and prone to answering slights with grisly executions. At least it wasn't a watch contract, Fortuna noted. So look on the bright side, there's only the one band of brutal killers after you for this. The Aztlan, whose name had been Yeadalkaatso, had apparently been bought to kill a god gone mad that had made a lair in some property near the eastern border of Estabra district. If Yeadal had still been one of the watch, that would have been very illegal, and the Aurelana brothers did not have the reputation of men foolish enough to put their names on illegal contracts. Most likely the man had been a deserter or a washout, and the brothers had bought his services intending to pretend they'd not known should trouble come of it. Tristan wouldn't get the watch for him after this, which was weight off his back, but that was cold comfort when the Roya was a death sentence on its own. "I can't pawn this," Tristan sighed, looking at the box. "They'll know it went missing and ask around with the fences." The thief liked some of the men and women who bought the goods he stole, but he would have been a fool to trust any of them. "You could keep it," Fortuna said. She liked to hoard things, that goddess of his, regardless of the wisdom of keeping them. It was said to be common in destitute gods like her. Sooner or later it would be found, Tristan murmured. He had no home, only hiding places, and those were only his so long as no one cared to take them from him. Hardly safe. Was abandoning the box the only path left to him? He balked at that, considering he'd killed a man for it. Besides, it might not even be enough. The Roya would ask around the merc for who had been planning jobs in Estabra, he thought, and he'd not thought to hide that much from the people he bought his supplies through. Perhaps if he stole again tonight to cover it up? He grimaced. Tristan was tired, needed to get that nick looked at, and he had not cased anywhere properly. It would be risky. And there was a chance they would find him anyway. When they did, he bit his lip. Something was wrong. Abuela's tests could be harsh, but they were never pointless or cruel. There must be more to this than he had seen. He kept looking through the papers, finding only some personal correspondence and an order lodged with a local butcher for a large quantity of meat. The very last page, though, was in a different handwriting. One he recognized. "Tristan, my dear child, they will hunt you. I sent you knowing this and knowing you would see my actions as a betrayal. There is a ship named the Blue Bell, at the Fishmonger's Quay, and before it will stand a man holding a list of names. Yours is one of them. That is your only way out. Cross the dominion of lost things, survive the trials, and you will be beyond the reach of any in the city. I will await you at the end of the aisle, Abuela." His fingers clenched. His breath shuddered. None of it had been an accident. If he had not killed the Aztlan, then Tristan would have made an enemy instead, and the threat would perhaps have been even worse. There had been no ending, when he entered that room, that led him back home. Fortuna stood at his shoulder, though he had never heard her rise. She had not bothered with the pretense. "The dominion of lost things," the goddess read. "What is that?" "An island," Tristan replied. "Proving grounds for the arrogant and the desperate." The Lady of Long Odds watched him with an excited grin, leaning against his side. "So we're going? In a burning house, a burning life, the only way out was through." "One more gamble," Tristan Abrascal quietly agreed. Chapter 2. Angharad dropped to the ground as the shot sounded. The stranger who'd stood in front of her was not so quick, and his face exploded in a shower of gore. "Sleeping god," she thought, sickened, as she reached for the long saber at her hip. There were a few screams at the grisly sight, but already the people of the street market were scurrying away into alleys. Angharad grit her teeth. This place was not like her home, like Peredur. There was no honor in Sacramonte, this horrid city of filth and rats. No one would help. Slowly, so that the sound would not give her away, Angharad unsheathed her saber as she crawled towards the edge of the stall that was her sole cover. She should look now, before her would-be assassin could reload their musket, but Angharad instead kept staring at the corpse of the man she had come here to meet. She found herself avoiding the sight of the gaping red wound made by the ball, gaze shying away, and lingering on the dark skin so much like her own. The stranger had been Mullany, by his accent, not Perduri like her. Not that the rest of Vespra ever thought of the Duchy of Peredur as anything but a petty province of the Kingdom of Malin. Her thoughts were straying, she chided herself. Fear had a way of doing that to her. Angharad mastered herself, breathing in and out slowly the way she had been taught. This was no display duel, no tournament of skill where the violence would end when blood or surrender ensued, but she had learned to kill her fear there, and she would kill it today as well. Her breathing calmed, her hand steady around the grip of her saber, Angharad popped her head out to look, and the musket ball went through her skull. And she kept rolling, a shot whizzing above her as a lightning-quick bite of pain tore at her shoulder through the dyed cloth of her jacket. She was bleeding, but she rolled all the way behind another stall even as she heard a man curse in Antigua. Angharad's lips tightened as she felt disapproval waft out of that deep place within her. The fisher had drawn on their pact when she had failed to, granting her that glimpse of what lay ahead, but the old spirit approved of neither fear nor recklessness. He would not twice extend his hand this way. "Come out," a man's voice called out from her right. "If you do, I'll make it quick." "Won't be that kind if you make it hard, girl." Angharad ground her teeth. She was a peer of Peredur, even her title had been struck down, and the last of the House of Tredegar. Did the man expect she would simply roll over and die when he asked? She drew on her pact, feeling as if she has touched cold water with the bottom of her feet. In her mind's eye she saw herself rise, but to her surprise the shot that took her in the chest did not come from the right but the left. There were two assassins, not one, she realized as she released the pact. Both of them with muskets. She hesitated. The odds were uncomfortably steep against her. Attack, her mother had taught her. Defense is delay. Angharad's fingers stumbled across metal goblet, a cheaply made thing of iron, as she groped along the ground. It must have fallen when the peddler owning this stall fled. Closing her eyes, she tossed it to her right. Before it could hit the floor, she drew on her pact again and glimpsed the muzzle of the muskets following the sound. Without hesitation she rose, glimpsing two silhouettes in the dim lamplight aiming their guns at her bait. Shadows filtered through the banners and poles of the street market, hiding her for most of a heartbeat as she began to run. A click, a snap, a shot, a ball went whizzing past her as she ducked under another stall. She drew on the pact again, eyes turning on seeing as she moved, and coldly smiled. It was the nearest assassin that had shot, as she had hoped. Angharad released the power, leaping over a clutter of pottery and keeping the killer now reloading her long musket between her and the assassin still ready to fire. The man of the pair shouted for his accomplice to move, but he was too late. Angharad kicked a stall of colorful ribbons into the woman's knees and she rocked back with a shout of pain, dropping the ramrod she'd been using to reload. Angharad met her eyes, gray to brown, and saw the fear there. She did not relish it, did not allow herself to, and swung her saber in a clean stroke. It ripped through the assassin's throat. Angharad drew on her pact, the fisher's quiet approval easing the coming of the glimpse. Smoothly the noblewoman caught the shoulder of the dying assassin before she could fall, keeping her body in the path of the panicked shot that followed from the other assassin. It didn't pierce through, having hit the middle of the back, and Angharad let the body drop as she leapt over the stall before her. The man was a tall and thinly Organon and his fear spread across his face like ink soiling water. He did not lose his wits, though, and kicked the last stall between them towards her. It toppled piles of dyed cloth, but Angharad had been quicker and she was already leaping over it. Her landing was off and she wasted a moment steadying her footing, long enough for the man to strike at her with the butt of the musket. Right into her shoulder, she swallowed a groan. That would bruise. She struck his chin in return, the guard of her saber crunching bone satisfyingly as the side of her blade bit into flesh, and with a hiss of pain the assassin dropped his musket. In his eyes Angharad saw the knowledge of his own death as the gun clattered on the floor, but she did not strike. Could not. The edge of her blade rested against the side of his neck. "Pick up your weapon," Angharad ordered, her Antigua crisp. The man went still, eyes flicking to the blade and then back to her. The fear drained, replaced with a smirk. "It's true, then, about you Milani nobles," he said. "All about honor. Won't strike an unarmed man." Angharad did not answer, simply withdrawing her blade and taking half a step back. "Fucking fools you are," the man mocked. "Worse than an infanzon. I'll just leave, and what are you going to?" The point went through his eye and into his skull, Angharad snapping her wrist to withdraw the blade cleanly. There was some debate among scholars whether a fair chance to take up one's weapon should be considered 3 or 5 breaths, so she had waited a full 5. She did not like to walk too close to the line in matters of honor. "I am not Melanie," she coldly informed the corpse as it toppled. She was of Parader, and the people of the High Isle had their own ways. She knelt to wipe the blade on his tunic before sheathing it, idly going through his pockets. A few copper coins, powder and shot. She took the coin, as she would need them for the corpse price, and it had been won cleanly by blade. The other assassin bore even less coin and a small dagger. The noblewoman returned to the cooling body of the man who had died trying to pass a message to her, the forever nameless Melanie, and set the copper coins above his heart in a circle. It was an old custom. The coin was for anyone to take who would be willing to see the body properly burned or buried. Feeling dirtied for putting her fingers to a corpse she had not made, Angharad forced herself to look through the dead man's pockets for a message. To her relief, a pocket within his blood-splattered coat contained a folded letter. It was from Uncle Ocean. There was no mistaking it. The small red seal keeping the letter closed displayed the two-tailed snakehead of House Tredegar. Ocean, her mother's youngest brother, had been allowed by her to keep using the family arms even though he had gone into exile to join the watch. Though they were estranged, Mother had always said it was more by reason of distance than bitterness. That distance was also why her uncle was the sole surviving member of Angharad's family, for the sleeping god moved in mysterious ways. She took the letter, not yet breaking the seal, and tucked it away beneath her coat. She looked around warily, still alone for now. The city guard might be hopelessly, and infamously, corrupt, but even they would not simply ignore killing in the streets of Sacramonte. Best begun by the time they arrived. Angharad took to the streets, going back the way she had come. Cortolo district was a maze of slender canals and curved bridges, its stone facades painted in shades of red and yellow that looked vivid in the warm light of the great pillars of Paul stone. Those relics had been laid down every few blocks back in the days of the Second Empire, and she had found them a wondrous sight at first, for her homeland had nothing like them. Only the Lyrganon at their height had been able to afford the luxury of letting stone pillars soak in the glare for decades. She had since shed the wonder. The warm glow of the pillars had weakened over the centuries, and now there were always shadows between their reach. The glories of the Second Empire were long gone, broken by great wars with the devils of Pandemonium, and the even more brutal wars between the powers that had emerged to claim primacy after the fall of Lyrgan. Another century, Angharad thought as she passed through a grove of orange trees, and the glare in those pillars would fade entirely. Sacramonte was far fallen from the peerless jewel of the Trebian Sea it had once claimed to be, and it fell a little further every year. The young noblewoman ignored the few street merchants who called out to her as she found the street she had been looking for, recognizing the painted eyes in red and blue on the side of a baker's shop. It made her uncomfortable that people, commoners, would call out to her in such a way. And there were so many of them. Angharad had visited many cities in Malin, when she dwelt still, but not even the capital of the kingdom was so thick with people as Sacramonte. It made her feel cramped, somehow. The inn she was staying at was one her uncle had directed her to by letter, a small but clean establishment where she was assured of the hostess' discretion. The middle-aged matron, a stout woman by the name of Luna, welcomed her with a smile as she passed the green-painted threshold. "Lady Marere," the hostess said. "You've returned early. Will you be in one to the meal, then?" Angharad's answering smile was stiff. It was not a lie, the name she had given. No peer of Peredur could be recognized in the rolls of the kingdom's nobility without first taking a Melanie name, her own being Anwar Marere. It had been the compromise honor allowed her between the secrecy Uncle Ocean had urged her to and the dishonor inherent in deceiving one whose roof you stayed under. It sat ill with Angharad, for all that she knew it was necessary, and Luna's graceful manners in referring to her by the name and title were as a little twist of the knife every time. "I do not yet know," Angharad replied. "I have correspondence to attend to before I can give you answer." "Is the solar vacant?" "It is, my lady," Luna nodded. "And I tidied it up this morning too." "Enter as you please." Angharad thanked her hostess and went up the stairs. She slipped into her room, long enough to shed her jacket and grimace at the red staining her pale shirt. The ball had nicked the back of her shoulder, deep enough to bleed her if not to touch muscle. Mother had shown her how to dress a wound when she'd been a girl and still dreamed of her following in her footsteps as a sea captain, so she clumsily cleaned the wound and wrapped a bandage from her trunk around her shoulder. The dark-skinned noblewoman still had 2 clean shirts, and she wasted no time putting one on, but that had been her last jacket. There was nothing left now but a formal dress and an overcoat, the latter of which she decided on. The trunk was half empty, she saw with a pang. She'd been able to bring precious little with her when she had fled Malin, only what friends of the family had been able to salvage from the townhouse in Indal before it too was seized. Clothes, coin, a few of her father's jewels and a handful of books. There were fewer of the last than she'd begun with, as she'd had to sell a few for a local coinage after docking in the Sanguine port. Angharad was not so callow as to be unaware that showing she had gold or jewels in a port could get her robbed or worse. She still had all 3 of Yabanathi's books of poems, at least, her very favorites in all the world. The first of them had been a gift from her very first love. Ariane Wen had been as exacting an opponent on the dueling field as she had been a companion to Offit, something that had first drawn but ultimately chased away Angharad. Still, the hard words of their parting had since lost their sting, and it was now with mostly fondness that the young noblewoman ran a finger across the spine of the book. It would have been easy to lose herself in reminiscence, Angharad knew. Easy and dangerous. If she lived in the past, she would be buried with it. She closed the trunk, her haste making the sound harsh, and crisply took her letter before leaving the room. Down the hall, past the 3 other closed bedroom doors of the inn, she found the small Solar's door empty and the shutters on its window open. She closed the door behind her, though there was sadly no lock. The chair and writing desk by the window were worn but comfortable and well tended to, much like the rest of the inn, and Angharad unclasped the sheath at her belt before seating herself. She sighed, leaning back as the scent of lemons and oranges drifted through the window on a subtle breeze. After a long moment, readied, she broke the seal on the letter and opened it. The looping and elegant calligraphy of her Uncle Ocean filled a few paragraphs. Like on every other instance, the older man failed to properly greet her as the Lady of Linhall. Angharad's fingers tightened, her teeth grit as for a moment she smelled ash on the wind and heard screams in the distance. It took a long moment for her to calm, for her breathing to even out. Her home was gone, her family was gone, everything and everyone she had ever known. And now even here, in this shatheep of a city halfway across Vesper, assassins still hunted her. The rage was familiar by now, a comforting burn, and she embraced it. Angharad Tredegar would have revenge on the man who had destroyed her family one day. She had sworn it, on that calamitous night where she had lost everything, and the fisher had heard her oath. The old spirit would see it through at her side, their contract a bond only death could sunder. Calmed anew, Angharad resumed reading. It was not long before she winced. She had hoped her uncle might come to her here in Sacramonte, but it was not to be. Ocean wrote that he had not been allowed to take leave from his work, as it had reached a critical juncture and he was the head of the Endeavour. As always, her uncle remained vague on what exactly it was he did for the watch. He was captain in rank, but Angharad knew that he was not part of one of the many free companies out in the field on contracts. Her uncle was not much of a fighting man, her mother had always said, but he'd always been clever with his mind and his hands. He had written of spending much time in the Rookery once, one of the great fortress islands of the Watch, so Angharad had come to suspect he might be a member of one of the 7 circles, one of the scholarly societies, probably. That meant influence among their ranks, from what little she knew of the workings of the Watch, as though all watchmen were counted as members of the order, less than a tenth of them were ever inducted into one of the circles. Uncle Ocean tersely apologized for being unable to come himself, but wrote he had meanwhile made arrangements on her behalf and learned of her enemy. "You were followed from Malin, Nice," he wrote. "Your ship was asked for by name at the Sanguine port, and silver flowed freely from men who had answers about where you had gone. I fear that the enemy pursuing you is no mere peer or a Zinduna, but instead a high noble, perhaps even a member of the High Queen's court. I am told by my acquaintances that the Guardia was not simply bought. Its officers were ordered by one of the great families of Sacromonte to kill you. Avoid the red cloaks at all costs. Angerade's lips thinned. It was worse than she had thought, then, and she had not thought it good in the slightest. She had her own suspicions as to the rank of the man who had ordered the end of the House of Tredegar, and though they were still only suspicions, to hear it confirmed that her enemy was wealthy and powerful only served to strengthen them. If the city guard itself was hunting her, she thought, then she must leave Sacromonte before long. It would be her death otherwise. Hopefully, then, her uncle had not simply written to tell her he was leaving her to her fate. She carefully read the rest, eyes narrowing when he cautioned her that he could not intervene too blatantly as her situation was a Milani matter and the watch was not meant to intervene in the affairs of nations without invitation. That might be true in principle, she thought, but hardly in practice. Yet her uncle might not have the influence to force such a matter, and if her foe was influential enough, Ocean's allies and superiors might not be willing to intervene on his behalf. It was dire news, but she took it as calmly as she could. Angharad had known it would be a possibility. Yet her uncle, it seemed, was not to abandon her. After trading favors, I have secured an opportunity that could place you beyond the reach of your enemy, no matter how powerful, Uncle Ocean wrote. Your name has been added to the list of candidates that are to undertake the yearly crucible on the island of Villa Perdita. It would be a perilous undertaking, I will not pretend otherwise. Fewer than 1 in 5 survive. Yet to succeed would make you a fully fledged member of the Watch immediately, robbing your foe of the ability to frustrate attempts at more traditional enrollment. It would protect you, Angharad. Even great lords do not dare offend the Watch, and your oath need not be a lifelong one. I urge you to take shelter among our order until you are fully grown and ready to face your enemy. There's little more I can do, for I have traded what I have to trade and now find myself short on debts owed. The man who handed you this letter is trustworthy and knows how to have coin made available to you should you need it. If you would send me a letter in answer, he can handle the matter for you. May many gods be with you, and those who are not miss. Captain Ocean Tredegar. Below there were scribbled directions to the ship that would take her to the Crucible should she wish to attempt it, as well as a note that the 2 days to embark were the 7th and the 8th of the 4th. Today and tomorrow, Angharad realized with a start. She must have been too slow in finding her uncle's agent. It was a troubling notion that she might have had a part in the man's death, and not the sole one that Uncle Ocean had brought at her door. He wanted her to join the Watch, and she could understand why well enough. He was right that it would afford her a great deal of protection, and that the oath would not take all of her life. Watchmen swore in sevens, and after 7 years Angharad expected she would be either dead or ready for revenge. It also meant, however, that she would formally be leaving her title as Lady of Lunhall behind. Blastcloaks could not hold titles while they served, and often not even after. She closed her eyes, gritting her teeth. It is already behind you, fool girl, she harshly whispered. The high courts of Malin had struck her title down before she even fled the kingdom. Her mother had been accused of high treason and her father of corruption, something or other about taxes, so the High Queen of Malin had given her assent to the removal of her family from the rolls of nobility. In the eyes of the law, Angharad was no longer a peer of Parator. The title she claimed was a meaningless one. And yet the thought of surrendering it felt like hot coals in her belly. She thought of Ash and screams again, shivering. It felt like a betrayal to abandon the title when she was the sole survivor of that horror. Could she really spit on the memory of her parents in this way? No, she decided. Her situation was not yet so dire that she could not attempt to write her uncle again for another solution. She still had coin enough to last a few months, and even if Ocean's agent was dead, her uncle could still be contacted through the offices of the Watch in Sacromonte. Folding the letter and tucking it away in her coat, Angharad opened the drawer on the side of the desk and took both paper and ink. She had a quill of her own, in her trunk, and she rose to fetch it. The door opened and Angharad froze. At the top of the stairs, a man in a red cloak was standing with a pistol in hand. Another was coming up the stairs behind him, and a moment of perfect stillness followed as Angharad met the guardsman's eyes. The pact came easy, telling her she was but a moment away from a shot being fired at her. "Shit," the red-cloaked man swore, raising his pistol and his voice. "It's her." Angharad shut the door just in time, the ball tearing into it with a spray of wooden shards. Keeping a foot on the door, she hastily snatched up her sheathed saber as another shot thundered against the wood. She could hear men shouting about breaking down the door. They must have thought it was locked instead of simply being held. Going through the corridor would be suicide, she thought, even if there were only two of them. Which she doubted. It left. Angharad glanced at the window, dipping into her pact. She grimaced. She'd get shot. The timing was slightly off. She released the pact and pulled at it again, trying to find the right moment. The door was about to be knocked down by two men using a bench, she saw. It was now or never. Angharad, holding her sheathed saber in hand, hurriedly crawled atop the table and pushed her way through the shutters even as the door was smashed down behind her. She fell through and down into the street even as the guard in the street below hastily snapped a shot at her and missed by a wide margin, ball ricocheting inside the solar. She landed on her feet, crouching down with a shout of pain but gritting her teeth as she forced herself to move. She dipped into the pact and coldly smiled at what she saw. The red-cloaked woman in front of her had a long cudgel in hand, but she dropped it to unsheathe a short sword. It was a mistake. Darting forward before the cudgel hit the pavement, Angharad smashed the pommel of her saber in the woman's throat and, as she began choking, slipped behind her. The shot that came from the solar window took the guardswoman in the belly. There were screams and shouts inside the inn, red-cloaked guards forcing their way back out to pursue, but Angharad took off at a run. She might not know the city, but a head start was a head start. She ran until she was out of breath, across bridges and markets, until she was sure she had lost the men and women of the Guardia. Only then did she allow herself to hide in a shady nook, near a tall stone pillar, and belt her sheath properly again. Gritting her teeth, she found herself leaning her forehead against a brightly painted wall. She'd been found. By now the Red Cloaks would have confiscated the last of her worldly possessions, leaving her with a wealth of 3 silver bowls in her pockets and the clothes on her back. That, and her saber, was now the sum of what Angharad Tredegar owned. She would have wept, were she not so angry at them for the unfairness of it all. But there was, she remembered, one last thing on her. The same letter she had tucked away, the salvation Uncle Ocean had offered. With trembling fingers, Angharad took it out and unfolded it. At the bottom of the letter, scribbled, was the name of the ship awaiting at Fishmonger's Quay. The Blue Bell. The young noblewoman breathed out, found her center, and tucked away the letter once more. Bury the past, Angharad murmured, or be buried with it. It was as simple as that. There was no refuge left to her save for audacity, and she would not meet whatever fate awaited her cowed or trembling. Angharad straightened her back and strode back into the light. Chapter 3 The Blue Bell was a sturdy old cog, its sail painted the black of the watch. Tristan was the first to arrive, which went against him. The sailors on watch were asleep at their posts, napping on crates yet to be loaded, and they'd not been pleased to be woken up. Even less pleased had been their officer, a one-armed crone named Salipa, who'd had to be fetched from her bed since she was the one with the roster. "You look like you're fresh off the street, rat," she glared. "You have the eyes of an eagle, Tia," Tristan flattered. "A rat is what I am, and like one I will disappear quietly into your hole should you let me." Her mood was not improved, sadly, and neither was his since Fortuna was now snickering behind him. "If his name isn't on the roster, throw him into the sea," Salipa ordered her men. "I don't care if you beat him first. Or take his cabinet." By the unpleasant smiles on the face of those two well-built sailors, he would be beaten bloody given half a chance. Charming. It was still better than to stay out in the murk and risk the Hoyoroya catching his tail. They wouldn't stop at bruises. "Who are you supposed to be, rat?" the crone asked. Tristan a rascal, he charmingly smiled. She was, again, visibly unimpressed. Her lips quirked into a nasty little number as she trailed her finger down the roster, sneaking an expectant glance at him, but then she froze. "On there, yes?" Tristan pressed. The old woman looked him up and down, disbelieving. "Whose brat are you?" Salipa asked. "You must have blood in the black." "My blood is buried shallow, Tia," Tristan replied, smile turned sharp. "May I come aboard or not?" The crone snorted, but he knew put on when he saw it. Something had spooked her. "Go on, then," Salipa said. "Down in the hold, you can claim a cot if it's on the ground." "Much obliged," the thief smiled. She turned to spit into the waters of the shoal. "If I see you try to get into a crate, rat, you'll get that beating you just ducked," the crone warned. It was not the warmest welcome Tristan had ever received, but it was far from the worst. The cog was mostly empty, its crew out in the city, but an armed man pointed him down the 2 sets of stairs to the hold after eyeing him suspiciously. There were a few sailors sleeping on cots down there, but otherwise it was only a few crates and empty room. Cogs were trading vessels, but this one looked made to ferrymen instead. Tristan stepped about quietly, looking for an empty cot with a wall at its back. Fortuna had been pleased with the amusement of watching him get browbeaten earlier, but now that it had passed, the goddess was remembering to be offended on his behalf. At her age, Fortuna mused, it would take only a slip to break her hip. "So I can sprain an ankle before taking the trials," Tristan murmured, careful not to wake a sailor as he shrugged off his cabinet's leather straps and set it down. "I think not. The luck always went hardest after him when it was used to hurt another. Every slight should be avenged, no matter how small," Fortuna said, tone disapproving. He rolled his eyes at her. Even destitute gods breathed arrogance, never learning the beggar's virtues. It was in their nature, Tristan had come to suspect, and the nature of gods did not change. Fortuna was the same now as when he had first met her, nothing more than a terrified boy on the run. The years they'd shared had changed her not a whit. "I'll think on it," he lied. She huffed. "Sometimes I think your blood is cold as a lizard's," she complained. "Does nothing move you to revenge?" Tristan smiled without joy, thinking of the 5 names carved into the marrow of his bones. His list. "Only the one thing," he answered. "And it is very far from this boat." He cast a look around after, wary of having spoken so long into what others would see thin air. The few sailors down here were still asleep, to his relief. Talking at the unseen was a good way to out yourself as a contractor, or a lunatic, though admittedly some days that line was razor thin. Fortuna sighed, then gestured for him to settle down in the cot. She would, as she'd had for years, keep watch over his sleep. He smiled again, meaning it this time, and slipped under the bedding. Back to the wall and a goddess watching over him, the thief fell straight into slumber. Tristan woke to the sound of a man coughing. "Company," Fortuna whispered into his ear. It could not have been more than a few hours since he fell asleep, early in the morning. Yet the light of a lantern, the cold glow sure sign the oil was mixed with Paulstone powder to lend an echo of the glare's pale light, was licking at the sides of the hold, held up by a bearded sailor ushering in a ragged band. The one who'd coughed was the first to limp into sight, a toothless old man still clutching his mouth. He was jostled aside by a scowling mass of a man whose leather vest left the arms exposed, revealing intricate patterns of ink. Menor Mano, Tristan recognized, eyeing the tattoos. This one had been a leg breaker. "Careful," the sailor warned the big man in a low voice. "Any fighting on the Bluebell will get you shot and thrown overboard. No warnings, no second chances." The leg breaker's scowl deepened and he glared at the sailor. "Keep walking, Blaskloak," he said. The sailor snorted, reaching for the pistol at his side. "You're one of the paid seats, not the recommended," he replied. "Mouth off to me again and I'll put a shot between your eyes." The big man's face contorted in anger, laying bare his broken nose and the flattest look of his face, but with a snarl he turned away and stalked off. "Thought so," the sailor muttered, then turned a cool gaze on the rest. "The same rules apply to you lot. Don't make me say it again." None of those remaining seemed inclined to challenge him. A pair that must be a couple, given how closely they held each other, shied away from the sailor's gaze as if afraid of being hit, while a girl around Tristan's age looked like she might start crying. It made the two who seemed unconcerned with argument stand out all the more. A bespectacled old woman looking half asleep and past paying attention to much of anything, then to her left a Tianxi of middle age who looked unimpressed. Tristan studied the cast of the man's shoulders and the way he stood ramrod straight, lips thinning. "Soldier." "Go on, then," the sailor grunted. "Find somewhere to sleep. The rest will arrive in a few hours." They shuffled into Redley, revealing the last three who'd stood behind. A blond youth with the city's look about him, looking at his surroundings with polite curiosity, and a pair of short Tianxi twins in their 40s. Women both, their dark hair kept in low ponytails with the side of their head shaved. The cut would have outed them as Meng girls even if their smiles had not revealed blue-tinted teeth. It was a custom of Meng's Yao Fein members to chew strands of D-root, a sweet-smelling herb said to soothe pains and sharpen wits, at the price of dying teeth and sometimes even tongues blue. As the newcomers settled across the hold, some of them waking disgruntled sailors, one of the twins caught him looking and shot back a quick once-over that led into a snort. She leaned close to her sister for a whisper, the two of them then turning to offer him that Meng grin of porcelain in white and blue. Tristan straightened, muscles tensing as they moved towards him, and the blue open robes in Tianxi style they wore over practical city tunic and trousers trailed. "Pinch me, Jew, I must be dreaming," the closest twin grinned. "Look at what we've got here." The other twin looked him up and down, making a show of it. Back to the wall, dirty fingernails and a crow's nest for hair. "Oh my, Lan," she snickered. "Smells like rotten here, doesn't it?" "She's not wrong," Fortuna conceded, ever the traitor. Yet Tristan's shoulders loosened, for all that the words were close to insult. It was to be that kind of a conversation. He was back on familiar grounds. Putting on a wicked look, he snorted back. Sniffing the air theatrically, he gasped in surprise. "And here I thought it smelled like dust and floating corpses," he told them. "But I suppose it might just be that foul herb you've been chewing." There was no need for either side to make the sign of the rat, not when the two had the Meng look good as a branded, and they'd sized him up in a breath, but it was worth establishing neither were mere mud from the murk, they were proper gutter, from the wrong side of men's laws. The tacit admission on his part he knew the main trades of the Meng, drugs and paid deaths, visibly put the sisters in a good mood. Only a fool would talk of trust between rats, but the gutter was a shared tongue. The thief invited them to sit, smile still on his face, and noted the elegant fold of their legs as they did. Sellers, he decided, or someone facing the front. That kind of presentation was learned. "Tristan," he introduced himself. "You have our names," Ju said. Not likely the real ones, but he was hardly offended. It was only good sense on their part, and he might have tried the same if he'd not had his own written true on the watch's passenger list. "So I do," Tristan said. "And the pleasure of your company, at an unexpected hour no less." He got twin inscrutable looks at the implied question there. "More interesting is that you were already here, Tristan," Lan replied. "We were given a precise hour to arrive, see, after Coin talked." An implied question of her own, with an offered trade tacked on. Given how little he knew of this whole business, the thief had no qualms in trading, it could only be to his advantage. As was only proper between rats, he paid up front. "A teacher had my name placed on the list," he told them. "I am uncertain if it is reward or punishment." One of the twins, Ju, had a small neck in the skin near her left ear, he noticed. Looked a little deep for a shaving miss, which was interesting, but mostly it would let him tell them apart in a pinch. Both sisters grimaced. "A hard teacher, if they might think the dominion of lost things a reward," Ju said. "But also not just anyone, if they could get you on this ship with only their word. We paid for it, see. We need the prize." He chewed the inside of his cheek. The prize to passing the trials, aside from not dying a horrible death, was to be inducted straight into the ranks of the watch. They must have had death dogging their shadow, to believe being part of the Meng's Yao Fein would not be enough to assure their safety. "I have left the burning bridge behind myself," he carefully admitted. "Unknowingly, I earned the Roya's ire." Lan leaned in, suddenly grinning again. Well now, that makes you a friend to these poor sisters, she said. No admirers of ours, the Hoya. Not since we were sent to open a shop in the murk. Tristan cocked his head to the side, curious, and lightly traced a finger across his throat. Ju shook her head. Merchandise, she told him. Dust, Wallaku and pipe poppy. He let out a low whistle. The Roya runs the parlors for those in the murk, he said. I thought the Meng stuck to the ducks? Noise was made back in the republics that we should cut out the middlemen, Lan said, tone bitter. We warned against it, told them it was a mistake, but why listen to us? We just live here. Then when the Roya went blood mad, they cut their losses, Ju cursed. The lizard sheds the tail in the tiger's jaws, they told us. It was Tristan's turn to grimace. Reading between the lines, the Meng's Yao Fein had cut loose the people they'd sent into the murk as an ill-fated attempt to cut into the Hoya-Roya's trade. Tossed in their heads as appeasement so knives could be sheathed and business returned to usual. There can't be many of you left, he said. Two, Lan replied, tone curt. And he was looking at them. No wonder they were desperate enough to take the trials as a way out. It was grim talk and he was at a loss as to where to go from there. With grace that only further convinced him they'd had front-facing roles, the twins guided the conversation away from the pit. You'd think that for the Ramas we paid the accommodations would be nicer, at least, Ju sighed, looking around. Tristan hid his surprise. A gold Rama was worth 3 silver arbols, each of which were worth 34 copper adizes. He'd only rarely had truck with arbols, much less their golden sisters. And so he sniffed a detail of interest, for though he could believe sisters that had been in the men could scrape together Ramas, the twins were not the only one who'd come tonight. The thief's gaze moved to the remainder of the 10 that had been guiding, skimming over the leg breaker and the woman with spectacles, lingering instead on the toothless old man, the shivering girl and the couple. The latter's clothing was threadbare, shabby. All were thin. Tristan doubted they could scrape a silver together between the lot of them. There are other ways to get in, he deduced. Lan followed his gaze to the old man and she chuckled. That one you have wrong, she said. We saw him settle with our own eyes, though he paid in books instead of coin. You're not wrong about most the rest. They are paid for, Ju smiled, mirthless. It's for bets, you see. How far they'll get, how well they'll do. Large sums by large men. Tristan's hands clenched. An old and familiar anger flared in his belly. Pallas sighed. He asked. Lan shook her head. Gutter, she said. The men Romano went heavy this year, I hear, but there's others. The anger simmered down. It was not in fanzones making sport of gutter lives, only monsters doing as monsters did. The thief hummed, considering the arrivals with fresh eyes. So who was I wrong about? He asked. Ju cocked a plucked eyebrow. Burned a bridge, you said, she invited. Fair, Tristan thought. He'd gotten more from them than the other way around. Robbed someone out on a contract for the Aurelana brothers, he said. It ended in a corpse. He saw the shift in the way they sat, the rise in wariness, but also the birth of a degree of respect. He'd been a resource, before. Now he was a potential asset. That'll get a man killed, sure enough, Lam amiably said. Ju cleared her throat. The pretty blonde, he is the other one that paid his way on board, she said. His name's Brun. It took a moment for Tristan's eye to find the youth in question, as he was tucked away between crates. Back to the wall, with an angle on most the room that let him look in without being seen and return. Not exactly shopkeeper's habits, these. Brun caught his look, offering a smile in reply. The thief looked away first. That one's dangerous, Fortuna murmured, leaning against the wall. And he's got someone with him. They're loud. Tristan stiffened. Someone, to the Lady of Long Odds, would mean someone like her. Another god. He'd known there would be others with contract on the ship, but it was not a pleasant surprise. Someone to be careful of, the thief warned the twins. They traded a look, then Ju nodded thanks for the warning. They did not ask why he would give such warning. Asking about someone's contract was the cat-killing sort of curiosity. They let in the desperate at night, Lan said, but the rest will be coming soon. The real contenders. The Infanzones, Tristan evenly said. They have seats promised to them under old accords. Even a rat like him knew that, mostly because the Infanzones themselves trumpeted it about. The yearly trials on the island were a way for young aristocrats to prove themselves skillful and daring, to jostle with each other for preeminence. The names of those who had gone and how far they'd made it were made public, spread around by criers at the Vermilion Festival every year. Rumor had it that making it as far as the third trial could get you bumped up in the line of succession. 15, Jew agreed. Mind you, noblesses won't even fill half of those. They bring guards and servants. He wrinkled his nose. Another pack to steer clear of. They aren't worth the worry, Landis missed. Nobles will play it safe, make it to the beginning of the third and then take the way out. There were two of those. The trials on the Dominion of Lost Things were meant to forge recruits for the Watch, but your average Infanzon had no intention of renouncing titles and wealth to join the Blastcloaks. So instead they took the paths of retreat the Watch had arranged on the island, safe places where a participant could desist from going any further. It's the recommended candidates that'll be dangerous, Lan continued. They are here for the prize and they won't be afraid to kill to make it. Tristan thinly smiled and the older woman looked somewhat abashed. He was, after all, almost certainly one of these recommended candidates. I hear most are foreigners, usually, the thief said, returning the earlier grace. Heard that too, Jew hastily agreed. Though I'm not sure how many there will be. There's at most 100 seats open every year, Lan noted, and we heard 73 were filled this time. There are 2 ships, though, and one sailed off yesterday. The other twin cocked a brow at him. Did you get a look at the passenger list? Tristan shook his head. But I saw it being read, he told her, and it can't have been too long. Around 30 names. The twins hummed. Like him they were curious as to how numerous their batch would be. The conversation drifted after that, staying friendly but of light nature. Neither side had more they were interested in trading, and it was too early in the venture to begin talking of the kind of alliances that would mean life or death when bodies began dropping. The twins took their leave before long, going around the hall to glad hand the others, the couple in particular, he noted. He ought to do the same, feel out the others for enmities and alliances. The large bruiser was asleep and not the kind of man he'd want to work with besides, so he had a frank look at the others. The 2 gray hairs were out of the running for now. The toothless old man was still coughing, looking half a step into the grave, and though the old woman seemed spry she bore spectacles. Should those be broken, she might well be half-blind. Disinclined to work the couple when the twins were already at it, Tristan considered the last 3. Brun was to be avoided, Fortuna's warning heeded, which left the girl shivering in a corner and the Tianxi with a soldier's bearing. The girl first, he decided. Her curly brown hair trembled with the rest of her when he sat down close, offering a smile that she visibly forced herself to return. She flinched when he rested his back against the wall. With that pointed chin and those wet eyes, she looked like a terrified bird. Tristan, he introduced himself. Marcella, she replied. The thief had held little truck with sympathy, either given or received, since burying his mother, but he knew how to feign the appearance of it well enough. Rough night? He gently asked. The girl had a full-body shiver, swallowing loudly. I shouldn't be here, she burst out, unable to help herself. It's not even my debt, but they said. You were forced to come, Tristan said. Marcella nodded, eyes shining with tears. I haven't seen either of my parents in years, but the moneylender said it didn't matter, she whispered. The law says it's my debt too. Did you try to flee? He asked, eyes studying her closely. Now that he was closer to the girl, he could tell there was something off. More than just fear. She kept flinching without obvious reasons for it, like she could hear or see something he could not. They hit pistols, Marcella replied. You'd have had a better chance with bullets than the trials, Tristan thought. You should have run. Her hands were trembling still, one rubbing her forearm as if to calm herself, and that was what let him put it together. She wasn't just rubbing but tracing a pattern with a finger. Something complex, a symbol of some kind with intricate lines. Again and again she traced it, never noticing even as she told him that she'd been promised the debt would be written off if she survived the first trial. Tristan smiled and nodded at all the right places, mind spinning. Marcella had a compulsion, a tic. One of the most obvious signs someone had just come into a contract and their god had strong hold on them. The thief ought to know. It had taken years for him to unlearn the habit of flipping a coin that did not exist. "It'll be all right," Tristan comfortingly lied. "We will be many on the island. With arms and numbers there will be some safety." Marcella twitched again, beginning to look at the ceiling before she stopped herself. A contract that enhanced her senses, perhaps? Whatever it was, she seemed to be drawing on it at all times, and that was dangerous. First to herself, but in time perhaps to others as well. The thief suggested she try to sleep before rising back to his feet, but neither of them much believed in her promise to try. Tristan then moved towards the soldier, who'd settled against a crate and was pulling at a copper flask. The smell of liquor, cheap and strong, wafted up as soon as he approached, the Tiangsi offering up a sardonic smile. "My turn, is it?" the man said. "At least you're not quite as obvious about it as the twins." Tristan sat down slowly, as to be sure he would not be provoking a man he now saw was armed. The sword sheath across the Tiangsi's lap was empty, but there was the bulge of a pistol tucked under his coat. "And my life for a sparrow's that he's got more knives than I do tucked away." "We'll be sailing out soon," Tristan replied, caught out but unrepentant. "Before we do I would know the lay of the land." "Practical of you," the man said, not offended in the slightest. "What's your name, boy?" "Tristan." "Young," the other said, offering a nod of a greeting. Tristan returned it, wary of this stranger who was putting away Rotgut like water but whose eyes were still sharp. "You've nothing to worry of me, Tristan," Young plainly said. "I was not sent here to play red games." The thief's eyes narrowed. A lie, at least in part, for the twins had told him of those who'd paid their way onto the ship and Young had not been one of them. Deciding that the man's easy temperament allowed for a gamble, he decided to press. "Yet someone sent you," Tristan said. "Your seat was bought by another." The Tiangsi grimaced. "Those two tell you that, did they?" he said, jerking his chin towards the twins. "You'd best be careful not to trust them too much." Tristan trusted no one at all, save perhaps Fortuna, but saw no need to tell the man as much. "And why is that?" Young lowered his voice. "Do you know why they're talking to the couple so much?" he asked. Tristan shook his head. "The husband, Felis, he's got scales on the arm and he's been..." Young trailed off, mimicking scratching his arm, and the thief could not entirely hide his revulsion. Skin flakes that looked like scales and incessant scratching were symptoms he was familiar with, as would be any child of the Mercs. The man was a dust addict. The twins would not have missed that, not with dust being one of the merchandises the Meng Xiao Fein pushed. If he goes into withdrawal and they have dust on them, they good as own him, Tristan thought. "There's no clean shoes in the Merc," the thief finally said, quoting half an old saying. "Shit clings to all our souls," the other half went. It was not absolution or forgiveness, but blame was like misery, one of those rare things there always seemed to be enough of to go around. Best to be careful with it, and with the Tiangsi as well. It was why he'd phrased his answer to have a hanging question. "All I need is to get to the third trial," Young bluntly said. "I've no interest in anything else." "Not even a black cloak?" Tristan casually asked. Too casually, he realized with a silent curse as Young's eyes narrowed. "Might put one on if it's offered," the man said. "You? Honesty or vagueness?" Honesty, he finally decided. Their interests were not at odds, and it was always best to stay on the good side of men with pistols and knowledge of how to use them. "I don't have a choice," the thief admitted. "I'm in it to the end." "Seems like we might have a thing or two in common," Young casually said. The offer hung in the air. It was too early to commit to alliances, Tristan knew, and yet did not decline. What were the odds he'd get a better offer? He was a rat, not the kind of sought-after soul that would be able to pick out their companions when the real recommended arrived. He wants something, the younger man decided. I'm fit and I look like I might be able to handle myself in a fight, but he might get better if he holds out until the others begin to arrive. Which meant Young wanted something that a rat was in the best position to give. Far from unsettling him, Tristan found the thought a reassuring one. An ally without a use was just fodder. The suspicion that he wouldn't just be a body to throw in harm's way settled his doubts. It seems like we do, the thief agreed. The Tianxi smiled. Good, he said. Then I have a suggestion to make. Tristan's brow cocked. So now came the price. I obtained the name of a sailor on this ship who likes gifts, Yang said. Someone that could be bribed. Always useful. And what would be gotten for that gift? Tristan asked. To sit in a corner as the rest of the travelers board, the Tianxi said. Being given names and stories by our friend. For a heartbeat, Tristan wondered how he was being had. He was being sent to learn information that might well save his life, so why would Yang ever allow someone else to learn it in his stead? It made no sense, unless he is a bought seat, Tristan realized. They won't let him out of the hold even for a bribe. But I've got a recommendation, so they just might. It wasn't a rat that Yang had been after, but someone who the blast cloaks wouldn't confine to the bottom of the boat. I like him, Fortuna decided. He's clever. Yang pulled at his copper flask again, the stench of liquor spreading. He's also likely a drunk, Tristan thought, not that the goddess would consider that a black mark on anyone's record. But a drunk was something he could work with, so he would. Let's get our friend that gift, then, the thief smiled, and the soldier smiled back. Lucia looked rather straight-laced, for a woman taking bribes. Her face was stern in that way that people became stern when they were uncomfortable and looking to take it out on someone else. You're going to be peeling potatoes, the sailor told him. So sit on the bench and shut up. As Lucia easily hit a stone on him in muscles and belly fat, while Tristan had a fondness for avoiding arguments with people who'd be able to snap his neck, he dutifully sat on the bench and shut up. The sailor passed him a peeling knife and dropped a misshapen potato onto his lap, grunting in satisfaction when he began to deftly peel away. He was freeing, a pittance, compared to the barrel of hundreds they were working through, when she finally deigned to address him. They'll be coming in 2 batches, Lucia said. The foreigners first, most at once, and then the noble brats. Though she was still glaring at him like he'd emptied her pockets instead of the very opposite, Tristan's fondness for the sailor could not help but mount. Anyone who held the infant zones in such open contempt could not be entirely bad. He'd caught her wording, though, and a question made it to the tip of his tongue. There it lingered, long enough the woman noticed. Out with it, she grunted. You said foreigners, he said. Not recommended. She nodded, looking approving for the first time since they'd met. Most years we only taken foreigners that got recommended, Lucia agreed, but this one's different. Some seats were handed out for companies to sell. Tristan brow furrowed. Why? The better question, boy, the sailor replied, whittling away at the potato skin, is why you're on this ship when last month one full of recommended from Sacramento sailed straight for the rookery. His brow furrowed even deeper. The rookery was the common name for the great island fortress that was the seat of the watch, said to be as a city of blast cloaks. Watchmen were trained there in a great war camp. I'm the only one from the city to take the trials, Tristan slowly said. That's got a recommendation, anyway, Lucia shrugged. He rocked back in surprise. What was Abuela up to? The more he learned, the more obscure her motives became. His companion lost interest in the conversation, and with a curt gesture told him to start peeling again. They stayed on the deck for an hour, working away until the others began to arrive. The bulk of the first wave arrived as a group, escorted by a pair of blast cloaks. Tristan watched them carefully from his corner of the deck. Lucia, for all that she seemed to enjoy none of this, delivered on her promises without qualms. See the Islands? Tristan nodded, eyes moving to the only 2 among the pack whose skin was the light brown common to those from the kingdom of Easley. a woman in her 20s and a boy that couldn't be older than Tristan himself, 18. The boy had pale eyes, but what drew attention to him was how eerily perfect he looked. Every part of his body symmetrical and proportioned, like he'd been sculpted instead of born. It made his skin crawl to look at. Don't know much about the girl, but the boy's called Tupac-Sickle, Lucia said. Recommended, he's some sort of prodigy trained by the Leopard Society. He's got a contract too. Not a likely ally then. These Cleese societies were bloodthirsty bastards one and all, always waging their famous flower wars. The two Ramayans got recommended because they have family in the black, the sailor continued, pointing at pair of youths. Of the many peoples of the imperial Someshwar, the Ramayans were those Tristan knew best. They held the great cities on the empire's southeastern coast, so their trading ships sometimes came as far as Sacramonte. He had never seen any dress so colorful as these two, though. The girl of the pair had no less than 3 pistols at her hips, making her a rather more impressive sight than the chubby-cheeked boy looking like he was about to keel over. Then you've got the 3 from our corner of the Tribbean Sea, Lucia grunted. A girl with unfortunate acne wore the jacket and cravat typical of the Asphodel Rectorate, one of Sacramonte's closest neighbors, and a Razani veiled from head to toe in gray was carefully staying away from her. Not unexpected, given that Razan and Asphodel were set to war with each other incessantly. The last was a tall and thin man with heavy circles around his eyes. The man's from Asphodel too, Lucia quietly said. Leander Galatas, a former sailor. Be careful of him. Tristan cocked his head to the side, eyes questioning. His recommendation came from the Navigators Guild, she said. Odds are he knows some signs. The thief's belly clenched. Learned men insisted that the signs were not truly magic, merely a way for the initiated to manipulate the gloam, but Tristan had heard stories. Winds called from nowhere, men said a light with but a word. And of those who used the stranger arts going mad, hollowing from the inside as the gloam devoured them. He silently nodded. The first arrivals disappeared into the belly of the ship, but Tristan stayed, waiting as the last 4 of the foreigners trickled in over the following hour. First a pack of 3 dark-skinned Milani, a younger pair whose hair and clothes screamed money, with a scarred older woman behind them that had a fighter's look. A guard, he figured. The younger 2 were recommended, Lucia said. I heard there's a Milani swordmistress coming, but it shouldn't be one of them. The last to arrive was Tianxi, a girl his age with a sword at her hip and a musket slung over her back. Her eyes were a startling silver shade. She was recommended by the rookery, the sailor provided. And she's got a contract for sure. The stranger's eyes swept over the deck, neither hurried nor slow, and for a moment Tristan would have sworn they lingered above his head. Then she walked on, disappearing below deck. Lucia frowned. There's supposed to be one more, she said, but at this rate the Infanzones will be getting here first. Her prediction came true. But half an hour later, Sacramonte's noble sons and daughters arrived in a colorful procession. There must have been 100 people crowding the docks, some mounted but most brought by carriages that servants in livery promptly began to unload. The 2 carriages at the front did not bear colors he recognized. Velazar and Ruesta, Lucia told him. Tristan hummed. He knew of the Ruesta, a family sworn to one of the great houses of Sacramonte, though he could not recall which one. Their wealth was famous. He had never heard of the Velazar. The Ruesta girl's a bloody idiot, the sailor growled. Brought 3 people with her, and would you believe that 2 of them are maids? The Velazar? He asked. Better, Lucia conceded. Got some Milani huntsmen, I hear. He was about to ask about the rest when the Velazar servants moved aside, revealing a sight that snatched away his breath. Painted on the sides of the last 2 carriages was a red tree on blue. Cherden, Tristan hissed. Lucia slowly nodded. Brothers, she said, with a valet, and he didn't hear the rest of the sentence because blood was rushing to his ears. Helping down some noble waste from his carriage was a man that Tristan the Brascal would recognize even if his eyes were plucked out of his head. It had been years, so the hair was longer and the beard touched with gray, but the burn scar near the ear looked the same. Tristan could still hear the casual drawl, smell gunpowder and blood. hear his father weep. Cosmiflor. So that was why Abuela had put him on this ship, sent him into these trials. She was giving him two of the children and the man whose name was at the bottom of his list. Fortuna's hand on his shoulder brought him back to himself. Kid. Lucia said, sounding impatient. What's with you? Nothing, Tristan lied. Our bargain is done. My thanks. The sailor blinked in surprise. He slid the peeling knife into his half-done potato, fingers clenching, and dropped it back into the barrel. There's still one missing, she said. We'll be waiting for her until midday at least. This is enough. One won't make a difference. Fine, she grunted. But you best not come complaining later. He shook his head and briskly took his leave, wanting to be in the hold before the nobles arrived. Fortuna walked by his side, red dress trailing on the floor behind her like a river of blood, and Tristan forced his jaw to unclench. I was wrong, he spoke under his breath as he reached the top of the stairs. What about? Fortuna lightly asked. There is only one thing that moves me to revenge, Tristan the Brascal murmured, but it appears it is not far from this boat after all. Chapter 4. They were waiting for her at Fishmonger's Quay. Every street had a pair of red cloaks watching passers-by, forcing any hooded or veiled to show their faces before they were let through. Angharade, keeping to the alleys, saw how they compared the faces to small pieces of parchment. She was only able to get close enough to see it was a drawing, but that told her enough. Her hunters knew what she looked like and where she was headed. Worried, Angharade decided on patience. She spent one of her last 3 silver bowls on a ratty room and a meal at an inn 2 blocks off the edge of the quay, figuring she would have a better shot come night. After the streetlights dimmed and the guardsmen tired, she would make a run for the Blue Bell. She got directions to the ship at the cost of breaking a second arbol to buy sailor's ale with coppers, then settled in to wait. The naps she took on the straw mattress were intermittent, somehow leaving her more tired than when she'd begun, all the more so when she was jolted out of the last by angry shouts. Awake in an instant, she drew her saber and made for the door. Cracking it open just enough to peer through, she saw a gaggle of red cloaks whose officer was loudly arguing with the innkeeper and his pair of toughs. Paid up for the month, you don't get to come in here and hassle my patrons, the innkeeper was snarling. Angharade did not hold out hope. One side had swords and muskets, the other clubs. The argument would last only so long as the Guardia officer let it. She stole a glimpse ahead, saw they would be taken utterly by surprise, and steadied her breath before bursting out. Defense is delay. The red cloaks had swords out, but not before she got a head start, only 2 at the back going for their muskets instead. Angharade kicked the table on the closest man's leg, tripping him as he shouted curse, then ducked low as a shot whizzed past her head. A stolen glimpse told her there was no ambush ahead, so she ran out into the night, boots thumping against the paved stones. The red cloaks followed. In a city so large as Sacromonte, it should have been the easiest thing in the world to lose them, but for all that she could steal away for slices of an hour, the enemy always caught up to her. They never seemed to know exactly where she was, but neither were they far off. Contractor, Angharade shivered in realization. They had hired someone whose spirit-given gift could find her. Knowing of it was little help, the hours stretching into a torment of constant running and hiding. She was exhausted, as much from the flight as the constant drawing on her own contract to avoid ambushes. The fisher was not as some other spirits, whose prices were constant. She had sworn a single oath in return for his gift. Yet that did not mean taking glimpses was not tiring, slowly turning her thoughts feverious. It felt as if her brain was swimming in warm water, pressure slowly building behind her eyes. How long could she last? She did not know, but salvation came without warning at morning's cast. Just as the streetlights returned to their full glare, the red cloaks fell behind. No longer was their hunt aimed, instead stumbling about as if she were no longer tracked. Relief brought tears to her eyes, and she crawled into dark alley smelling of trash and human filth to collapse behind a pile of broken planks. What felt like a heartbeat after she woke to the sound of movement, drawing her saber, but before her was no man. It was a red-eyed rat, large as a cat and watching her unblinkingly. Behind it, Scrawled on the wall, she saw a bloody mark she had missed in her earlier exhaustion. 7 rats whose tails were tied in a knot, itself swallowing up a skull. It was raw work, little more than outlines, but somehow she knew exactly what she was looking at the moment she saw it. Swallowing loudly, Angharad dropped her blade. It clattered loudly against the ground. "Manifold apologies, honored elder," the noble hurriedly said. "I did not mean to disturb your shrine." The red-eyed rat watched her still, unmoving. An apology would not be enough. Grimacing, Angharad slowly reached for her abandoned saber and pressed her palm against the edge. It cut shallowly but drew blood, enough she was able to hold out her hand and drip red on the stone before her. After the third thick droplet fell, the great rat finally moved, darting forward to lick at the red, while Angharad let out a relieved breath. Her offering had been accepted. Rare were the spirits that would turn on you immediately after accepting a gift. In the moment that followed, the noble felt her blood cool, as if a cold tide were washing through her veins. The fisher's presence filled her. He felt neither angry nor worried, only expectant. The spirit was watching, and the red-eyed rat stilled for a moment before licking up the last of her blood. "Good manners," it praised in a voice that was like a thousand chillers threaded into a single, desperate scream. Angharad struggled to keep her horror off her face, a struggle that she lost when the massive rat suddenly began to retch. It convulsed, as if dying, and spewed out what she thought to be red bile. Only the bile was in the shape of the rat. The fisher's approval rose at the sight, and his presence withdrew, shivers strumming down her spine in his wake. That moment of distraction was enough for the red-eyed rat to be gone from her sight, leaving only the scrawled mark on the wall and the bloody little abomination at her feet. Sheathing her sword, Angharad rose hurriedly and pressed the cut on her palm closed. She would have taken the time to dress it if not for the blood rat beginning to scurry away. Gritting her teeth, the dark-skinned noble cast aside her hesitation and followed the boon the spirit had granted her. It stayed always in the corner of her eye, moving so quick that she could not spare so much as a glance at her surroundings as she followed. Weaving through a maze of dirty alleys she ran, slowly coming to realize that she was being led in the direction of Fishmonger's Quay. The little creature kept away from the glow of lamplights and tall stone pillars, its path labyrinthine, but through shadow after shadow Angharad was led to an end. The stink of sewage filled her nostrils, making her gag, and as she had a dry retch she saw the little blood rat glancing at her once before scurrying to the edge of a sewer gate. There it broke apart, turning into drops of blood that slid into the cloying vileness. Minding her manners, Angharad offered the sewer gate a shaky bow of thanks before covering her mouth. She carefully stepped to the edge of the alley, eyes squinting at the lamplight's glow she had somehow grown unused to. Dealing with spirits was never simple as you might wish. For the first few glances she was lost, until she peered further out and saw a pair of bored red cloaks inspecting everyone passing through the street. Only, Angharad saw, she was already past them. Heart beating in relief and excitement, the noble turned to the sewer gate and bowed again. "I will remember this favor, honored elder," she promised. In the heartbeat that followed, a gun was cocked behind her, and Angharad Tredegar was duly reminded that dealing with spirits was never simple as you might wish. "Don't move," a woman's voice harshly ordered in Antigua. "Turn around and show me your—" If she ran for it. The ball tore through her back, a line of burning pain. Angharad threw herself to the side, the shot catching the edge of her coat. In a single smooth spin she unsheathed her saber and faced the red cloak, who judged she would not be able to reload in time and was dropped her musket in favor of the straight sword at her hip. The noble timed her breaths with her steps, her body moving with the fluid grace of years of practice. There was no need to steal a glimpse of the future when she could see it written in the lay of her enemy's movements. The red cloak's blade came free, striking out, and Angharad calmly twisted her wrist to deny the blade's contact before snapping it back into place. Her back foot pushed her forward in a clean, textbook strike that opened the red cloak's throat. The other woman fell down with a wet gurgle, the sound drowned out by the Guardia killers already coming this way. Angharad ran for it, the directions she'd bought last night just enough for her to avoid charging off in the wrong direction. This cursed hovel of a city had no signs, as if Sacramontans expected all to know their way around. The docks were close, only a few blocks away, but the ruckus had seen people empty the streets so Angharad could see the Redcloaks running after her. Only a dozen, at first, but more were coming from seemingly every street. She hurried, sweat pouring down her back as she struggled to stay out of musket range. Shots kept sounding, keeping the pulse of fear in her belly alive, and finally reached the long stone dock she'd had described to her. An old cog was waiting at the end of it, its sails painted black like all the watch's ships, and Angharad felt her spirit rally. Close, so close now, and the shot came from closer, the window of some warehouse behind, and though she threw herself down in time it was straight into a pile of crates. Mercifully empty, she thought, even as her aching shoulder toppled two into the water, but she got tangled in the net keeping them together. Ripping her way free cost her precious time, the pack of baying hounds nipping at her heels reaching the dock. "Stop her," a man shouted. "May knees be my witness, if you keep fucking missing her." The bluebell was a mere 30 feet away, but the Guardia were so close she could almost feel them breathing down her neck. Half turning, she saw a man reaching for her arm and twisted away, but then there was a shot and the Redcloak stopped cold. It had come from the front of her, Angharad realized belatedly, and there she found a grizzled old woman holding a smoking pistol in her only hand. She'd unloaded in front of the Redcloaks, a warning shot. "Angharad Tredegar?" the old woman called out. "Yes," the noble replied, the word half a sob of relief. "We've been waiting for you, girl," the Blastcloak grunted. "Get on the bloody ship, we're going to miss the tide." Angharad took a hesitant step towards the bluebell, then saw her hesitation reflected on the face of the Redcloaks looking at her and was emboldened to take a second. Before she could take a third, a Guardia officer pushed his way to the front of the pack, a mustachioed young man whose shoulders were dripping with ornate braids and medals. "What are you idiots doing?" the man shouted. "Take aim, she's under the protection of the watch, boy," the old woman interrupted from above. "Turn around before this gets unpleasant." Angharad slowly took another step back, trying not to draw anyone's attention as she was uncomfortably aware that there was no cover at all on the dock. It was all bare stone. There were at least a dozen muskets in the crowd, and with that many people aiming at her, a glimpse would not be able to save her life. "Boy," the young man repeated, turning red. "It's Captain to you, you old bitch, and you best disappear back into your ship before I—" Angharad took another step back, but this time she was noticed, and half a dozen muskets were turned on her. Yet in the time that had passed, the Blastcloaks had not been idle, and now sailors leaned over the side of the ship to aim their own muskets down at the Redcloaks. She counted 9, a number that had her stomach clenching. Were there not more sailors on the ship? "Before you what?" the old woman sneered. "You so much as take a shot at us, boy captain, and it's a war you'll have on your hands." "A war I'll win," the mustachioed man retorted. "I have the numbers to storm your ship if you do not desist." He seemed confident, and as Angharad glanced at the still swelling numbers of Redcloaks, more were still coming from the back street, she had to admit he was right. Not all of them had firearms, but all were armed, and there had to be 40 by now. The Blastcloak laughed scornfully at the threat. "And what do you think'll happen after?" she asked. "Once word gets to the rookery that Sacramonte has broken the Iscariot Accords, that you attacked the watch ship in the discharge of its duties." A ripple of unease went through the guardsmen. "Our orders are absolute," the officer flatly replied. "They'll recall every company from Broken Gates to the Weeping Light, boy," the one-armed Blastcloak said, "to burn this fucking city to the ground. To make an example of Sacramonte." She scoffed. "Only whoever owns you won't want that war on their head," the Blastcloak said. "So instead what'll happen is that they'll send all your heads to the rookery in a basket as an apology before denting their treasury for reparations." Unease turned to dismay, a few guardsmen even taking a step back. The officer's face was bright red with anger, but he had no answer. "I wonder how the Infanzones will like paying up for your mistake," the old woman added with a nasty little smile. "Surely they're forgiving souls. They wouldn't take it out on your families after you die." And that was the shot that sounded the rout. Another officer, older but with only half as many gaudy medals, took the captain aside and spoke in a hushed voice. It was a done deal anyhow, the rank and file already putting away their weapons. Whatever loyalty they had, it did not stand stronger than the prospect of having their heads cut off. For all that she was grateful, Angharad could not help but feel a threat of contempt. True soldiers would not have balked in the face of threats. It was the weakness of Sacramonte that it did not have proper ruling nobles, a weakness that trickled all the way down. "I'll remember this," the captain snarled, tearing away from the other red cloak. "And we'll remember you, boy captain," the blast cloak called back. "You ought to be a lot more worried about that." The Guardia cleared out in haste, as if ashamed of being seen driven away, and Angharad at last let out her breath. She'd made it. The old woman called out for her to hurry, and she raced up the ramp, seeing that hidden behind side of the ship there had been another dozen sailors. They were putting away muskets and orbs of metal bearing fuses that Angharad recognized as Zentianli, those dreaded Tianxi grenades. No wonder the one-armed woman had not feared the red cloaks, packed tight as they had been on the docks. Without cover, it would have been a slaughter. The noble offered said blast cloak a short bow of gratitude. "My thanks for your protection, my lady," Angharad said. "I will not forget it. The name's Salipa, and I'm no lady of any kind," the old woman snorted. "You owe me nothing, girl. You've got blood in the black and you're kin of oceans besides." She blinked. "You know my uncle. We were both part of the hunt for the Hull Eater," Salipa told her, then tapped the stump of her missing arm. "After Thrall took a bite, he helped set me up on the Blue Bell." Angharad choked. The Hull Eater, as in the great spirit whose claws rent ships apart and whose army of crazed thrills had famously turned some ancient fortress into a den of horrors. Its death a few years ago had been widely celebrated back home, but Uncle Ocean had never so much as hinted he'd been involved. She could hardly imagine a man her mother had always considered, however fondly, to be useless in a fight anywhere near such a monster. At loss about anything to say, the noble got out something about how her uncle was a dutiful man while Salipa herded her across the deck towards broad stairs descending into the belly of the cog. "I'll be 2 days before we get to the Dominion," Salipa quietly said. "Use the time to find allies, Tredegar. Loners always die early in the second trial." It would have been ungrateful of her to demand that a woman who'd saved her life address her properly as Lady Angharad, so the noble bit down on the sentence before it could leave her lips. Instead she nodded her gratitude at the advice before traversing the lower deck, the kitchen, dormitories for the crew and the arsenal, to make her way to the hold at the bottom. There she found the travelers she would share a journey with, having haphazardly claimed corners and cots. All eyes were on her from the moment she entered, the cost of being the last to arrive, but she kept her back straight. It would not do to show weakness. A sweeping look at the hold told her there had to be more than 20 people in there, but what drew and kept her eye was the well-dressed quartet being attended to at the back of the hold. 2 men and 2 women. The men's close looks and identical red and blue cloaks outed them as kin, but the other 2 were dissimilar, one tall and lean, her short blonde hair pulled in a bun, while the other was a sultry dark-haired beauty with beautiful green eyes. Nobles, she instantly knew. Infanzones, as Sacramontans called them. The beauty met Angharad's eyes, smiling sweetly, and then addressed an older girl at her side in servant's livery. A few steps later the handmaiden was offering Angharad an elegant curtsy, bowing her head. "Lady Isabel invites you to introduce yourself, my lady," the girl said. Angharad acknowledged her with a polite nod, gathering herself for a moment before approaching her fellow nobles. The men looked bored at her approach, one of them even seeming irritated, but Lady Isabel's smile was yet sweet and her leaner companion looked curious. As the invited party, Angharad introduced herself first. "Lady Angharad Tredegar of Lyn Hall," she said, lightly bowing. "At your service." "How genteel," the green-eyed beauty exclaimed, putting a hand to her heart. "I am Lady Isabel Ruesta, Lady Angharad, but you must call me Isabel." "It would be my very great pleasure," Angharad replied, struggling to keep her gaze off the flattering cut of Lady Isabel's dress. Most her lovers had been cut more from the cloth of the other noble lady here than lovely Isabel's, but Angharad could appreciate beauty in all its forms, including form-fitting dresses of yellow brocade. As a willful distraction, she turned to the woman by Lady Isabel's side. Lady Ferranda Vilazar, the lean woman, introduced herself, tone cool. "A pleasure." Angharad returned the courtesy, though she was barely done speaking when one of the men cut in. "You have the Mullany look, but the name does not fit," the noble drawled. "Strange." Angharad's expression grew stiff, and the implied accusation of being an impostor. "That is, Raymond, because she is not Mullany," the other man scoffed. "These are Perduri names." He then offered her a bow and a practiced smile. At second look he looked older than the rude one, his face sharper and more refined. "I am Lord Augusto Cherton," he said. "Please forgive my brother's rudeness, Lady Angharad. He never did learn his courtesies." "It is nothing, Lord Augusto," Angharad briskly replied, her mood soured. It was soured even further by Lord Raymond's appraising gaze on her. "Ah, Peredur," the Infanzon said. "I had quite forgot about it. You're not much paler than the other Mullany, though. I expected more of a difference." Angharad's jaw clenched. Peredur was not like the other isles of the Kingdom of Malin. It was nearly impossible to conquer without a great fleet, so Angharad's ancestors, unlike the Mullany, had not swept across the island in a storm of iron and flame. They had instead settled the land and allied with the ancient dwellers of Peredur, twined the blood and slowly grown into a single people. And the ancient Perduri had been men of pale skin, so to this day some ignorant souls expected Angharad's people to be much paler than the Mullany. The polite ones, anyway. The less polite liked to imply that the ancient Perduri had been hollows, darklings. Utter madness. The isles were drenched in the light of the glare, no hollow could have lived there without burning. Besides, some savage tribes encountered in the colonies had proved that some peoples of light skin were not soulless, turned pale not by the embrace of the gloam but simply born with such flesh. Yet it suited some to imply the people of Peredur were descended from slaves and savages, the same hordes that allied with devils to bring about the old night. "Alas," Angharad frigidly replied, "it seems I must disappoint." "Raymond," Lady Isabel chided, gently slapping his arm. "Be nice." "Oh, I suppose," Lord Raymond groused. "The pleasure is all mine, Lady Angharad." Isabel seemed more amused than anything, which brought a glimmer of satisfaction to the younger Cherton's eye that Angharad recognized. "Ah," she thought. Perhaps her appreciative gaze had not been as subtle as she thought. From the corner of her eye she saw Lord Augusto eyeing the Lady Isabel and his brother with evident displeasure before brushing it away with a forced smile. He made a chiding comment about immaturity, injecting himself between the two. Angharad almost winced. "It appears your coat was scuffed," Lady Ferranda said, drawing back her attention. "A traveling misfortune." The other woman's steady gaze lay where the stray shot had caught her overcoat earlier. Angharad had no intention of mentioning her troubles to these strangers, fellow nobles or not, but then she suspected that Ferranda Vilazar was well aware she was not looking at a simple scuff. "There was a mishap with my trunk," Angharad replied, carefully avoiding a lie. "I will be traveling light." "Oh," Lady Isabel gently said as she drew away from the brothers, "that simply won't do. Lady Angharad, or may I call you Angharad?" "Charmed," she returned the Sacramontan smile. "Of course." "Then call me Isabel," Angharad, the beauty firmly offered again. "My maids can take care of mending your coat, they are very clever with their hands." She hesitated for a moment, but the bandage she had put over her wound on yesterday should not show under her shirt. Besides, it would be suspicious to refuse. "I would be much obliged," she said, shrugging off her coat. "Beatrice," Isabel called out, summoning another handmaid. "Do mend Lady Angharad's coat for her, would you?" "Of course, my lady," the dark-haired maid replied, curtsying before she approached. She took the coat when Angharad offered it. Isabel slid a look at Lady Ferranda. "You really should have brought a maid, Farah," she said. "Your man does not look like he knows how to use a needle." "Sonali serves a different purpose," Lady Ferranda replied. "I can take care of my own affairs, Isabel." There is no need for that hired sword, I assure you. Lord Raymond smiled. I will be seeing to our safety, as will our good Cosme. One of the finest soldiers in Cheriton service, second only to my own finer blade. If only your rapier were half as swift as your bows, Lord Augusto mildly said. Though he speaks true, Lady Ferranda, that it is our duty as sons of Cheriton to see to your safety through this trial. We must never abandon woman in need. How kind, Lady Ferranda replied, her tone savagely even. She did not seem impressed, Angharade thought, but then it was not on her that Augusto's eyes had lingered. Lady Isabel smiled back at the older Cheriton, but in the following moment let out a little noise of surprise before flowing forward. Warm fingers grasped Angharade's left arm, pushing up the sleeve of her shirt and bearing the 10 silver lines tattooed there over dark skin. A tattoo, Isabel said, her touch soft. What might it mean, Angharade? The looks the Cheriton brothers sent her were distinctly unfriendly. Lady Ferranda cut in before she could gather her wits enough to answer. Swordmistress, the tall woman said, breathing out in surprise. Those are the marks of a Milani swordmistress. They would have been, were they black and on Angharade's right arm instead, but after that early buffoonery from Raymond she was disinclined to explain the nuance. It is a similar tradition, Angharade simply said. Suddenly the Cheritons looked rather more wary of her. Wary enough to try to send her away, she figured, but whatever intention there might have been it immediately came to naught. Lady Ferranda's eyes lit up at her admission, leading into the first smile Angharade had seen out of the other woman. You must stay with us, then, Ferranda Vilazar firmly said. I happen to have a great many questions about such practices. Much as Angharade was used to the company of other nobles, she was also used to her family's title being among the lesser in the room. Though mother had been wealthy and of some renown as a captain, Linhall was no great estate. Compared to the great Azinduna families some of her tournament competitors had come from, the house of Tredegar had been ants. It had therefore been a skill worth cultivating to be able to tell who the powerful people in her room were. Playing court with the foreign fanzones let her fall back into the habit, and it was, if not comfortable, then at least a little nostalgic. The House of Cheriton, she learned, was by far the greatest of the noble lines involved here. Though it was not one of the founding families of Sacramonte, who traced their descent back the heyday of the Second Empire and good as ran the city, it was not far below them. While Augusto and Raymond were not of the main line, they were great-nephews to the lord of the house and therefore not men to discount. They also despised each other. Watching them descend into thinly veiled snapping for the third time in an hour, Angharade cocked an eyebrow at Lady Ferranda. The tall noblewoman sighed, waiting until Isabel leaned forward to play peacemaker between the brothers before she answered. There is an inheritance involved, she murmured. Raymond is younger but has obtained a contract. Marrying well would settle the victor. And Lady Isabel Ruesta would be, Angharade deduced, a very good marriage indeed. Not only was she a great beauty, but she was the sole daughter of the Ruesta, a house of undistinguished descent, but which happened to be very wealthy. No wonder the brothers went at each other like rabid dogs whenever one drew her attention over the other. Poor Isabel, Angharade sympathized. Lady Ferranda shrugged. She was a woman of few words and tread with care around the others. Unsurprising, given that the Vilazar were the least of the three houses by a fair throw. She had been quite frank about her intent to use a strong performance in the trials to gild her family's name and bring it back into the eyes of her fellow infanzones, perhaps even securing an advantageous husband. She had been preparing for this venture for years, going as far as to obtain the services of a man called Sonali, which she claimed to be a Milani huntsman. Where from? Angharade idly asked. Given the reputation of Milani marksman, it was not an uncommon claim even among those who'd never so much as seen the Isles. Does it matter what particular island tossed him out? Raymond chuckled, rolling his eyes. Euthugil, Lady Ferranda replied, ignoring him. Angharade leaned back in the seat she had been offered, taking a look at the elaborate beadwork hanging off this Sonali's cloak where he sat among the servants. She could not see his face, but the colors of the beads were distinctive to the low isle. It seemed a credible claim. I was taught they are the finest shooters and trackers in Malin, the noble acknowledged. And therefore all of Vesper, though it would be impolite so say as much. Terrible seafarers, however. Mother had always mourned so few took to ships given how good they were with muskets. Lady Ferranda straightened, visibly pleased, and Isabel pouted. You take it all too seriously, Farah, the dark-haired woman claimed, then daintily rose to her feet. And I must admit I grow weary of this dreary hold. Shall we go for a walk? Augusto, the older Cheriton, wasted no time in mimicking her and offering his hand. Too right, he said, you and I can, no need, brother, Lord Raymond cut in. You stay and rest, I will escort our fair lady. Lady Ferranda looked as if she had a downing headache, but she stayed out of it, and Angharad decided it might be best for her as well. The Cheritons argued, growing more irritated and worse at hiding it. Isabel then cut through the backbiting by offering Angharad a sweet smile. Would you do me the honor, Angharad? She asked. I never did get you to tell me of Parader. The glares that earned her felt like they would burn through her clothes, which irritated her enough she accepted out of spite. I am at your disposal, of course, she said, smoothly rising to her feet. The brothers' face darkened, but they were not so impolite as to insist when an invitation had been clearly given and accepted. Angharad offered her arm for Isabel to take and they headed for the stairs, though her eyes strayed to the site as they moved. She heard Lord Raymond mentioning other Milani earlier, but now she was finally seeing them. Seated between crates, talking in low voices, a young pair of youths were tucked away. Behind them a scarred older woman was napping. The man of the pair, narrow-faced but built like a fighter, kept glancing around, as if looking for something. Or someone, Angharad realized with a trickle of cold dread. Her pursuers had known she was headed for the Blue Belt, for these trials, and tried to stop her getting on the ship. But would they truly stop there when assassins had dogged her steps all the way from Parader? It had not occurred to her until now that there might be a hired knife for waiting for her on the ship. Uncle Ocean's letter had implied that there were few rules during the trials, that much was allowed. Perhaps even murder. The thought had her tensing enough that Isabel noticed. Thankfully, she misinterpreted the reason. They can be a little much, the dark-haired beauty admitted. It will do me some good to have some fresh air and good company. Have they always been like this? Angharad asked, grateful for the change of subject. They rose up the stairs, drawing the attention of the sailors on the lower deck as they passed. No one tried to stop them, as a few hours past an officer had come to tell them it would be allowed for a few travelers at a time to come up for air so long as they stayed out of the way. They were sweeter, once, Isabel wistfully said. But we all have duties now. It complicates matters. Angharad inclined her head. She had never held any interest in men, but the contrary had not always been true. Her status as the heiress to Hall had sometimes made it a difficult affair to decline without giving offense as a lady. The lives of nobles did not belong to them alone. Sometimes I wish I could be free of all this, Isabel confessed as they went up the last of the stairs. That I might find love where I please instead. As if by fate's whim, she finished the sentence just as the two of them took to the deck and the sight of it caught in Angharad's throat. Lovely Isabel in her yellow brocade, with eyes like emeralds and her delicate face framed by dark hair like raven's wings, all of it with the Trebian Sea spread out behind her as far as the eye could see, waters touched with golden lucent streaks as the great mirrors and devices in firmament above spread shards of the glares light across an entire sea. It was an unearthly sight, one that dried Angharad's mouth and left her half a babbling fool. She swallowed. Isabel smiled. But I must be boring you, she said. Never, Angharad insisted, cursing herself for the unseemly haste of the reply. Isabel, if she had noticed, was kind enough not to comment as she led them to the edge of the ship. There they leaned against the side, letting the wind ruffle their hair as the Blue Bell sailed across the tranquil waters of the Trebian Sea. It was a strange sight compared to the dark waters around the Isles, where the darkness of the gloam ran deep. Unlike her own people, the powers that bordered the Trebian Sea had never had to fear a ship disappearing into the dark and returning years later, if at all. The lights coming down from firmament were only thinly of the glare, but they were enough to prevent most storms from forming and, more importantly, prevent sailors from catching gloam sickness. Rare were the seamen of the sea who were severed from the circle by lack of exposure to the glare, turning into pale hollows without an immortal soul to reincarnate. "Look, it's so far already," Isabel enthused, pointing in the distance. Angharad followed the finger to the sight of two beams of glare falling from firmament onto a cluster of distant, lesser lights like swords cutting through the dark. Sacramonte, unlike most great cities of Vesper, had not been raised under some blessed machinery of the antediluvians that doled out light in patterns. It stood under a simple pit of glare. The light that touched the city's noble districts came from a hole ripped into firmament, coming raw from the unblinking sun that had turned the old world to ash and dust. "You should see the isles, one day," Angharad chuckled, shaking her head. "They are all under one great pit whose light covers all but the furthest edges of Pereter and Uthukil. It can be seen from weeks away if there is no gloam storm hiding it." "I would much like to travel, one day," Isabel smiled, "but surely our corner of Vesper does have some charms?" Angharad bit down on a very smitten answer by forcing herself to look away. A shape on the horizon delivered her beleaguered spirit a reply that would not make a fool of her. She nodded, pointing at a crooked and half-submerged tower jutting out of the sea in the distance. It glittered with great broken mirrors and other machinery. "Certainly, there is nowhere else where so many ancient wonders remain," Angharad said. Though many were now broken as the tower must be, their purpose lost to centuries or their intricate mechanisms beyond even the finest craftsmen of Tianxia. The antediluvians had built their miracles in the ancient times of the First Empire, untold centuries ago, and Vesper had gone through many a ruin since. "I would have thought fresher delights able to be found," Isabel told her, tone gone a little tart. Angharad coughed, embarrassed, as she tried to read the other woman's face to no avail. The dark-haired beauty sighed, idly laying a hand on Angharad's arm. The noble cursed the knots in her tongue that were stubbornly refusing to undo. And to think she had been complimented on an artful seduction by her last lover. "Tell me of Pereter," Isabel asked, perhaps taking pity. Angharad gratefully did, speaking of the stony and barren shores where forests of ships nestled in secret inlets, of the green rolling hills and deep forests that grew as one traveled east. Isabel seemed fascinated, always asking more, and though it all felt like it had only been a moment, the ache of her arms against the side of the ship told it had been much longer than that. It was time to take their leave, but Angharad begged off, going back down with her companion. She spoke of wanting to have a last look around the deck, though the truth was that she wanted to put herself together. It was a sweet parting, and Angharad closed her eyes, letting out a long breath. She had been much too obvious and was ashamed of herself. It had been improper behavior for a lady of her breeding, and a poor idea besides, given how Isabel Ruesta had some rather insistent suitors after her. Regaining her calm, she opened her eyes to see the ship approaching the ruined tower she'd sighted earlier. In the waters around it, tucked under dark ripples, ghostly shapes were swimming. She squinted, leaning further over the side, and made out a stripe going down the spine that bore the ghostly light on some spindly arms. From the fresh angle she could even see that some of the creatures were swimming besides the ship. Mantics. Angharad nearly leapt out of her skin, drawing back and reaching for her blade as she turned towards the woman who'd addressed her. Tianxi, she saw, and wearing her dark hair and a braid down her back. A fair girl no older than Angharad herself, but whose silver eyes were unsettling. The more she saw them, the more she grew convinced they were not of a natural shade. The Perduri noble's hand stayed close to her saber's hilt, for the other woman had a weapon of her own, a straight sword in the Tianxi style, a jian. "I beg your pardon. They are called mantics, the creatures you're looking at," the stranger elaborated. Learganon claimed they feed on the corpses of sailors who died too young. They're scavengers, however, Lars and not lemurs. Most nations did not speak of the world as Melanian Perduri did, all spirits under the sleeping god, but instead used the old Learganon terms. Lars, for beasts that partook of ether but were not necessarily hostile to men, and lemurs for those that hunted mankind out of hatred regardless of need. "Thank you for the lesson," Angharad slowly replied. She even half meant it. The interesting thing, the stranger mused, is that they are said to avoid ships. Angharad frowned. Some are following us, she pointed out. And have been for several hours now, the stranger agreed. It is the third time I have come up to look. The noble took a wary step back. This no longer felt to her as a meeting of happenstance, idle talk between shipmates. Who are you? She asked. Why are you approaching me? I simply wanted to have a look at the woman shots were fired over, the Tiangsi calmly replied. As for my name, you may call me Sung. Angharad's fingers closed around the hilt of her blade. You've had your look, she said. So I have, Sung agreed. And you are as interesting as I thought you might be, so I leave you with a warning. The Tiangsi made to leave, pausing only before she passed Angharad. Do not let yourself think this ship is safe. At this rate, there will be trouble long before we reach the island. And on that ominous note, the dark-haired stranger walked away. The noble watched her go, the grip on her saber loosening only when the song disappeared below deck. The wind brushed against her face, and Angharad was left wondering if it had always been so cold.